Breck Holloway spat on the warning sign, laughed, and kicked it flat into the mud with the heel of his boot. "A woman living alone thinks she owns a whole mountain," he said to his four men, and they laughed with him. He drew his knife, carved his initials into the fence post she had built with her own hands, and stepped across the line like it was nothing. "Let her come tell us to leave," he sneered. What Breck Holloway did not know was that the quiet woman watching him from the tree line had once ended lives from a mile away, and she was already counting. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. If you believe some boundaries should never be crossed, subscribe to this channel and stay with me all the way to the end of this story, because it only gets better. And do me one small favor, comment below and tell me the city you're watching from right now so I can see how far this story has traveled. All right, let's begin. The first thing anyone in the valley learned about Ava Carter was that she did not want to be known. She came into the county on a gray Tuesday in early autumn, driving a used pickup with Montana plates that were still fresh from the DMV, and she paid cash for 640 acres of mountain that nobody else had wanted. The land was steep and stubborn. Half of it stood at an angle a horse couldn't climb. There was one spring, one old logging road that washed out every spring thaw, and a hunting cabin so rotted through that the previous owner had listed it as a liability rather than a feature. The realtor, a heavy-set man named Gus Pryor, who talked too much and listened too little, had assumed she'd back out once she saw it. Most people did. Ava had walked the property for 4 hours in silence alone, while Gus waited by his car and checked his watch. When she came back, she didn't ask a single question about the well or the road or the winters. She only asked one thing. "Who else comes up here?" Gus had chuckled. "Well, nobody's supposed to, but you know how it is. Hunters, locals, folks been walking these ridges since before either of us was born. They don't mean nothing by it." Ava had looked at him for a long moment, and Gus would later tell his wife that there was something in that look he couldn't quite name. Not anger, not fear, something flat and level and patient, like a still pond that you suddenly realized was very, very deep. "They will," she said, "they will what means something by it. Eventually." Then she signed the papers and drove up the mountain, and for the next several months, the valley barely saw her at all. She came down once a week, always on the same day, or always at the same hour. And this alone was enough to make the locals talk. People in small towns noticed patterns, and a woman who did exactly the same thing every 7 days was a puzzle they couldn't leave alone. She bought lumber and fencing wire and bags of concrete. She bought canned food and coffee and batteries. She bought a chest freezer, a generator, and rolls of something the hardware clerk didn't recognize until he read the box: infrared trail cameras, the kind serious hunters used. Except she bought 11 of them at once, and nobody hunts with 11 cameras. "What's a lady need with all that?" the clerk, a young man named Toby, had asked, trying to be friendly. "Privacy," Ava said. She never raised her voice. She never seemed rushed. She counted her change without looking down at it, which Toby thought was strange, and she always parked her truck facing the exit, which he didn't think about at all because he didn't know yet that it meant anything. She wore the same kind of clothing every time, muted colors. Nothing that caught the eye, boots that had clearly walked 1,000 hard miles. She carried herself in a way the older men in town recognized without being able to explain. Earl Dawson, who'd done 2 tours in Vietnam and now spent his mornings at the diner drinking decaf and complaining about his knees, watched her cross the parking lot once and set down his cup. "That woman's a soldier," Earl said. His friend Cletus snorted. "She's 130 pounds soaking wet." "Didn't say she was a big soldier, said she was a soldier. Watch how she walks. She's reading the whole lot. She knows where every car is, where every door is, who's standing where. She did that the second she stepped out of the truck, and she's still doing it." Earl shook his head slowly. "That ain't how a civilian moves. That's how somebody moves who's been shot at." Cletus laughed him off, but Earl didn't laugh, and he watched her until she disappeared into the store, and something old and cautious stirred in the back of his mind. Up on the mountain, Ava built her life the way she did everything, deliberately, without waste, without witnesses. She tore the rotten cabin down to its foundation and rebuilt it herself, board by board, over 11 weeks. She dug a root cellar. She ran a rainwater catch. She reinforced the door with a steel core and hung it on hinges rated for far more weight than a door that size would ever need. She cut clear sight lines from every window. She learned the mountain the way she had once learned foreign cities, before an operation not as scenery, but as a system. Where the wind came from in the morning and where it turned in the afternoon. Which draws funneled sound and which swallowed it. Where a person could stand and see everything, and where a person could stand and be seen by no one at all. She built her fence last, and she built it to be seen. That was the part that locals would misunderstand later. They assumed the fence was meant to keep people out. It wasn't, not really. Ava knew that no fence keeps out a man who wants in. The fence was a message. It was a line drawn in daylight so that no one could ever say they hadn't seen it. Every 100 yards she hung a sign bright and unmissable that read, "Private property, no trespassing, no hunting." Below that in smaller letters a single line, "You are being recorded." She meant it as a courtesy, a warning, a chance. She would give them every chance. She had learned in a life she never spoke about that the giving of chances was not weakness. It was accounting. It was building a record so clean that when the reckoning finally came, no honest person could ever say she hadn't tried. The first trespass came 11 days after the last sign went up. She found the boot prints at the northeast corner near the spring, 2 sets coming in over the fence, where a fallen pine had knocked the wire down. Someone had climbed the tree and dropped over. They'd walked the game trail down to the water, stood around, smoked. She found the cigarette butts, foreign brand filter, crushed flat, the way a nervous man crushes them, and then walked back out the way they came. They hadn't taken anything. They'd been scouting. Ava crouched over the prints for a long time. She measured them. She photographed them beside a ruler. She noted the depth, the stride length, the wear pattern on the soles. One man was heavy and walked flat-footed, tired out of the shape. The other was lighter and quicker and led the way. She cataloged all of it in a hardbound notebook, dated and precise the way she had once written intelligence reports that other people's lives depended on. Then she rebuilt the fence stronger and she moved one of her cameras. She did not tell the sheriff. Not yet. She had learned that too. You do not spend your ammunition on the first shot. You wait. You build. You let the enemy show you who he is. They showed her within the month. The second time there were 3 of them. They came in the same place, and this time they didn't leave without taking something. They shot a mule deer doe 200 yards from her cabin, gutted it on her land, and dragged it back over the fence, leaving a smear of blood in a gut pile and a trail of arrogance she could read as clearly as a signature. They had done this before on this exact mountain for years. She could tell by how comfortable they were. They didn't hurry. They didn't whisper. One of them had stood not 60 yards from her cabin, close enough that she'd watched him through her scope from the dark of her doorway, and he had looked right at her building and laughed at something the other said, and turned his back and walked away without a care in the world. Ava had kept the crosshairs on the back of his neck for 3 full seconds. Then she'd lowered the rifle, exhaled, and written it all down. The man who laughed was named Breck Holloway, though she didn't know that yet. She knew him only as the leader, the one the others deferred to, the one who set the pace, the one whose confidence held the group together like a keystone. She learned to recognize him before she learned his name. She learned his walk, his voice carrying up the draw, the particular ugly music of his laugh. Breck Holloway was 44 years old, and he had never in his life been told no by anyone who could make it stick. His father had owned half the timber leases in the county before the mills closed, and Breck had grown up believing the mountains belonged to men like him by a kind of natural law. He was big and loud and generous with his friends and merciless with anyone weaker. He ran a small crew of men who hunted with him, drank with him, and never quite dared to cross him Dutch. His second, a wiry man with a mean streak. Cole young and eager to impress. Marcus quiet and uneasy and along mostly because he owed Breck money, and Randy the heavy flat-footed one, loyal as a dog and about as thoughtful. They had hunted that mountain for 20 years. When the land sold, Breck heard about it at the bar, and he heard who bought it, and he laughed so hard he spilled his beer. A woman, he said. Some woman from out of state bought the whole Carter Ridge. You believe that? Heard she's ex-military, someone offered. Breck waved that away. They let anybody in the military now. Cooks, typists, don't mean nothing. He drank. That's our mountain boys. Been our mountain since my daddy's time. Some woman puts up a little fence that don't change a thing, if anything. And here he grinned, and the men grinned with him, because that was what you did when Breck grinned. If anything, it just makes it more fun. That was the sentence more than any other that set everything in motion. If anything, it just makes it more fun. He would think about that sentence later on the worst night of his life when there was nothing left of his confidence but a cold animal terror, and he would not be able to remember why he had ever found it funny. But that came later. First came the escalation, and the escalation was slow, and that was the cruelest part because a slow escalation gives everyone involved the chance to stop, and no one ever does. Ava documented the third trespass and the fourth. She photographed the vandalized signs. They had started using her private property signs for target practice, and she found them peppered with buckshot and one of them torn down entirely and thrown in the spring, fouling her water. She photographed the ruts where they'd driven an ATV across her meadow. She photographed the beer cans, the shell casings, the carcasses. She built a file that was in its cold completeness, almost beautiful, a portrait of 5 men who believed with total certainty that no one was watching and who were wrong. And then only then she went to town and reported it. Sheriff Daniel Mercer was a decent man and a hard job. He was 58 years old, 3 years from a pension he'd earned twice over, and he had spent his whole career learning the one lesson that all good small-town lawmen eventually learn, that most trouble is not about the law at all, but about people who refuse to leave each other alone. He'd known the Holloways his entire life. He'd gone to school with Breck's father. He knew exactly what kind of man Breck was, and he knew exactly how much he could do about it, which was almost nothing, and it shamed him. When Ava Carter walked into his office and set a folder on his desk, he expected the usual: a complaint, some blurry photos, an emotional story he'd have to talk her down from. That was not what he got. He opened the folder and went quiet. Inside were 40 pages, dated entries, measured footprints, photographs of trespassers' faces clear and identifiable, pulled from her trail cameras, and Mercer recognized every one of them. GPS coordinates, a running log of dates and times that established a pattern any prosecutor would dream of. She had built a case so clean and so complete that Mercer felt absurdly like a student handing in a homework assignment to a teacher who had already done it better. "Ma'am," he said slowly, this is thorough. "I'd like it to stop," Ava said. "That's all. I'd like them to stop coming onto my land." Mercer rubbed the back of his neck. "I understand, and I'll tell you honest, I know these men. I'll talk to them. But I want to be straight with you, because you seem like somebody who'd rather have it straight." He tapped the folder. "This is good. This is real good. But trespassing on unposted rangeland in this county in front of a jury of people who've been walking these mountains their whole lives, that's a fine, maybe, if it even gets that far. And the man behind it," he stopped himself. "Breck Holloway," Ava said. Mercer looked up sharply. "You know him." "I know his face. I know his walk. I didn't know his name until you just told me." She said it without heat, without emphasis, the way a person reads a grocery list. "So, Breck Holloway." Something about the way she said it made the hair on Mercer's arms stand up. He'd interviewed hard men in his career. He'd sat across from killers, and not one of them had ever unsettled him the way this small, quiet, unremarkable-looking woman did, sitting in the chair across his desk with her hands folded and her voice as flat as a frozen lake. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "can I ask what you did in the service?" For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes, not fear, not pride. Something more like grief. "I was a marksman," she said, "a sniper. That's a word people use." She stood smooth and unhurried. "Sheriff, I'm going to ask you to talk to them. I'd like that to be enough. I would genuinely, truly like that to be enough." She picked up her copy of the folder she'd made. 2, of course she had, and tucked it under her arm. "But if it isn't, I want it on the record that I asked. I want it on the record that I came to you first, that I did everything right. Why does that matter so much to you?" Ava paused at the door. When she answered, she didn't turn around. "Because I've seen what happens," she said, "when people finally run out of chances. And I don't ever want anyone to be able to say I didn't give every last one." Then she was gone, and Mercer sat alone in his office for a long time with the folder open in front of him, and a feeling in his gut he couldn't shake, the feeling of a man who has just watched a storm cloud form on the horizon and knows with absolute certainty that it is coming his way and that there is not one thing he can do to stop it. He drove out to the Holloway place 2 days later. He found Breck in the yard working on his truck, and he laid it out plain: the complaint, the photos, the documentation, the fact that this woman had a case and knew how to use it. Breck listened with a grin that got wider the longer Mercer talked. "She got pictures of us," he said, delighted, "on her little cameras. Danny, that's the funniest thing I heard all week. Breck, I'm asking you to leave her be, as a friend. We ain't friends, Danny. We're friendly. There's a difference. Breck wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the truck. That's Carter Ridge. My daddy hunted that ridge. His daddy hunted that ridge. And now some woman from out of state, what did you say she was, some soldier? Girl, she's gonna put up a fence and tell me where I can walk. He shook his head, still smiling, but the smile had gone cold at the edges. No, that ain't how it works. That ain't ever how it worked. You go on back and you tell her that a fence is just wire and wire cuts. Breck, she wants to play soldier, that's fine. He pushed off the truck and turned back to his engine, done with the conversation, done with Mercer, done with the whole idea that anyone could tell him no. But she ought to remember, out here, there's 5 of us, and there's 1 of her. Mercer drove home that night with a headache behind his eyes and a sentence turning over in his mind that he couldn't make sit still. There's 5 of us, and there's 1 of her. Breck had meant it as a threat, as arithmetic, 5 against 1. But Mercer kept thinking about the woman in his office, about her flat, calm eyes, and her folder full of measured footprints, about the way she'd said, I was a marksman, like she was confessing a sin, and he found that the arithmetic didn't comfort him the way it comforted Breck. Because Mercer had known men like Breck his whole life, and he understood exactly how their minds worked. And he was starting to suspect that he had no idea at all how hers did. When Breck's men heard that the sheriff had come out and heard how Breck had sent him packing, they laughed and clapped him on the back and drank to it. All except one, Marcus. Marcus was the quiet one, the reluctant one, the one who was only there because he owed money and because it was easier to go along than to explain why he wanted out. He was younger than the others by a decade, and he'd done a hitch in the Army, nothing glamorous, motor pool, 2 years, and a general discharge, but it had been enough to teach him something the others had never learned. He knew what real soldiers were like. He'd met a few of the quiet ones, the ones who'd been to the bad places and come back wrong, and he'd learned to give them a wide berth because there was a stillness to them that told you they had already decided how far they were willing to go, and it was farther than you. Breck, Marcus said carefully that night after a few beers had loosened his tongue, maybe we ought to just find somewhere else. It's a big county, plenty of deer. The table went quiet. Breck looked at him for a long moment. The hell did you just say? I'm just saying, this woman, she's ex-military. She's got cameras everywhere. She's got the whole thing documented. She went to the sheriff. That's not some scared lady. That's somebody who plans. Guys who plan like that, man, they what? Breck's voice had dropped low and dangerous. Finish it, Marcus. They what? Marcus looked around the table. Dutch was watching him with contempt. Cole was smirking. Randy just looked confused. And Marcus understood in that moment that there was no version of this where he came out of it looking like anything but a coward, and that Breck would never ever let him forget it. Nothing, Marcus said. Forget it. No. You started, you finish. You scared of some woman, Marcus. That little skinny gal up on the mountain got you shaking in your boots. Breck leaned in, and the whole table leaned with him, and the pressure of it was a physical thing. 'Cause I'll tell you what, if you're too scared to walk on a mountain my family walked for 100 years, then maybe you ain't a man I need in my crew. And maybe I start thinking real hard about that money you owe me. Marcus stared at his beer. Now, Breck said, sitting back, satisfied, the danger draining out of his voice as quickly as it had come. We're going to go up there this weekend, all of us, and we're going to hunt, and we're going to have a good time, and if that woman's got a problem with it, she can come talk to us like a neighbor, face to face, man to, he laughed, man to woman. The others laughed with him. And if she don't like it, well, there's 5 of us. Marcus didn't laugh. He was thinking about the last time he'd seen a person as calm as the sheriff had described that woman being. It had been overseas, a contractor who trained with the special operations guys, and Marcus had watched him field strip a rifle blindfolded, and someone had asked him if he'd ever killed anyone, and the man had gone very still and very quiet, and said in the flattest voice Marcus had ever heard, "You don't ask a question you don't want the answer to." That was the voice Marcus imagined coming out of the woman on the mountain, and he did not want the answer. But he owed Breck money, and he was afraid of Breck in the small, immediate way that men are afraid of loud, dangerous friends, and that fear was closer and louder than his fear of the quiet woman he had never met. So when the weekend came, Marcus loaded his rifle into Breck's truck with the rest of them, and he told himself it would be fine, and some deep animal part of him knew that it would not. Up on the mountain, Ava watched the weather. She had been in the service long enough to know that the enemy always tells you when he's coming if you know how to listen. She'd watched the pattern of the trespasses tighten. She'd watched them grow bolder. She'd read the sheriff's visit in the way the men's behavior changed afterward, not chastened but emboldened, as if the fact that the law had come and gone without touching them proved that the law couldn't. She'd watched Breck's crew scout the deeper draws, the ones closer to her cabin, and she understood what it meant. They were going to make a point. They were going to come, all of them, and they were going to hunt right in front of her, close enough for her to see, and they were going to dare her to do something about it. She sat in her cabin the night before in the dark, with her notebook open and a single candle burning, and she did something she had not done in a very long time. She thought about this man she used to be. Not the woman she was now, the operator. She used to be the tool that other men had pointed and fired. She thought about the missions in the mountains on the other side of the world, and the faces, always the faces, the ones she'd watched through the scope in the last moment of their lives. She thought about how she had come to this mountain to bury all of it, to be no one, to want nothing but silence and the passage of undisturbed days. She thought about how they would not let her have it, and she made a decision alone in the dark that she would look back on for the rest of her life. She decided that she would not kill them. That was the line, and she drew it as carefully as she'd drawn any line in her life. She had killed enough. She had come here precisely so that she would never have to kill again. She would not give these small, stupid, arrogant men the power to turn her back into the thing she'd spent years trying to stop being. But she would not let them take her peace either. There was a third path. There was always a third path if you were patient enough and cruel enough and disciplined enough to walk it. She would not touch them. She would not fire a shot. She would not lay a finger on a single one of them. She would simply give them in full and terrible measure exactly what they were asking for. They wanted the mountain. Fine, she would let the mountain have them. She blew out the candle. She sat in the dark. And somewhere in the valley below, 5 men slept the easy sleep of the untroubled, dreaming of an easy weekend on a mountain they thought they understood, with no idea at all that they had just crossed a woman who had spent her entire adult life learning the precise and patient art of making the powerful feel afraid. The last thing Ava did before she finally slept was write one line in her notebook under the date in her small square hand. They're coming Saturday. All 5. I gave every chance. Let the record show I gave every chance. Then she closed the book and she closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She felt ready. Saturday came gray and cold, with a low ceiling of clouds sitting on the peaks like a lid on a pot, and the 5 men drove up the washed-out logging road as far as the trucks would go, and then walked the rest loud and laughing, their breath steaming in the raw air. Breck led the way. He always led the way. He walked straight past the first of Ava's signs without even glancing at it, and when Cole made a joke about it, Breck reached out and tore the sign off its post as he passed and let it fall in the mud, the same way he'd knocked down the first one weeks ago. The same careless, casual violence, and the men laughed, and Marcus at the back of the group watched the sign fall face up in the dirt and read the small line at the bottom before Randy's boot covered it. You are being recorded. Marcus felt something cold move through him. He looked up at the tree line, at the deep, still timber room all around them, and for just a moment he had the absolute, unshakable certainty that they were being watched. Not imagined watched. Watched. He could feel it on the back of his neck like a hand. Breck, he said quietly. Breck, hold up. But Breck wasn't listening. Breck was already 30 yards ahead, striding onto Ava Carter's land, like a king returning to his kingdom, calling back over his shoulder in a voice that carried up every draw and echoed off every ridge on the whole silent mountain. Come on out, soldier girl, Breck shouted, and he laughed, and the laugh rolled up the mountain and came back changed. Come on out and say hello. We brought enough for everybody. Nothing answered him. Nothing moved. The mountain took his voice and swallowed it and gave back only silence. A silence so total, so patient, so complete that even Breck Holloway, for one brief involuntary second, felt the smile falter on his face. He didn't know it yet, but she'd already begun. She had been in position since 3 hours before dawn in a hide she'd built weeks ago, and never used a place she'd chosen because from it, she could see the entire lower approach and be seen from none of it. She'd watched them leave the trucks. She'd counted them, all five exactly as she'd predicted. She'd watched Breck tear down her sign and she'd felt nothing at all, which she noted with a distant clinical interest, because a younger version of herself would have felt something, and the fact that she didn't told her how far into the cold place she'd already gone. She watched Marcus stop. She watched him look up at the tree line. She watched him feel her. Interesting, she thought. That one knows. She filed it away. The one at the back knows. He'll break first or he'll break last. The ones who see it coming always do one or the other. She'd learn which. She had time. She had all the time in the world, and they had until the light failed, and after that, the mountain belonged to her completely, and they would learn what that meant. She did not move. She would not move for hours yet. That was the discipline of it, the part these men could never understand, that the first weapon was patience. That fear is a seed you plant and then leave alone. That the worst thing you can do to a confident man is nothing at all for long enough until the silence starts to talk to him in his own voice and tell him things he doesn't want to hear. Let them hunt, she thought, watching Breck stride deeper into her land with his rifle on his shoulder and his men strung out behind him. Let them laugh. Let them think there's 5 of them and 1 of me. By the time the sun goes down, she thought, and something in her that she had buried for years stirred and stretched and opened its eyes, they're going to understand the truth. There was never 1 of me. There was 1 of them alone up here, times 5. And there was the mountain. And there was me, down below her, unaware, laughing, tearing up her land, and shouting insults at a woman he could not see and did not understand. Breck Holloway raised his rifle, sighted on a deer that wasn't there, and fired a single shot into the empty air, just to hear it echo, just to make noise, just to prove the mountain was his. The crack of it rolled up the draw and off the ridges and came back and back and back, fading until the silence swallowed it too. And in her hide unseen, unmoving patient as stone, Iva Carter opened her notebook to a fresh page, wrote down the time of that first shot in her small square hand, and began at last to work. She would not fire her rifle. She had promised herself that, and she kept her promises even to herself, especially to herself. But there were so many other things a person could do to a man who'd walked willingly into the dark if that person had spent 20 years learning the difference between killing a man's body and killing a man's certainty. And of the two, Ava had always known which one lasted longer. A dead man is at peace. It's the living you can truly reach. It's the living who carry the mountain with them for the rest of their days, who wake at 3 a.m. for the rest of their lives with the taste of that fear still in their mouths. She capped her pen. She watched them spread out across her land, and she began to take the mountain apart around them quietly, invisibly, one small impossibility at a time, in a way that would leave no mark on any of their bodies and a mark on their minds that no doctor would ever be able to find, and no amount of years would ever quite erase. The first thing she did was so small that not one of them noticed it for almost an hour. She simply began to move their world 1 degree at a time in ways that could not possibly be happening and let their own minds do the rest. Because that was the secret Breck Holloway was about to learn, the secret that would still be echoing in his skull on the last worst night of his life, long after the search teams gave up and the case went cold and the story became a whisper in the valley below. You cannot fight a war against someone you cannot see, and you cannot win a mountain from someone who has already become it. The first hour on the mountain belonged to Breck Holloway, and he spent it the way he spent everything, loudly, wastefully, and with the total confidence of a man who has never once been made to feel small. He fired 3 more shots into the empty air that morning, not at anything, just to hear the mountain flinch. He tore down 2 more of Ava's signs. He stopped at the spring and urinated in it, laughing, telling the others it was a message telling them the soldier girl could drink that if she got thirsty. Dutch laughed. Cole laughed. Randy laughed a beat late the way he always did because he was never quite sure which things were jokes until he saw the others laughing first. And Marcus, at the back, did not laugh at all because Marcus was watching the tree line, and the tree line was watching him back. He couldn't have told anyone how he knew. There was nothing to see. That was the whole problem. There was nothing to see, and there should have been. A mountain in the fall is a busy place. Birds, squirrels, the small, constant motion of a living forest going about its morning. But from the moment they'd crossed onto her land, that motion had stopped. The birds had gone quiet. The squirrels had gone still. It was as if the whole mountain were holding its breath, waiting. And only Marcus seemed to feel the weight of it pressing down on the back of his neck. "Breck," he said for the third time that morning, "something's not right." Breck didn't even turn around. "You said that already." "I mean it. Listen, you hear that?" "I don't hear nothing." "That's what I mean," Marcus said. "You don't hear nothing. On a whole mountain at 9 in the morning, you don't hear a single bird. That's not natural, man." Something's got him spooked. Breck finally stopped. He turned slow and looked at Marcus with an expression that had gone from irritated to something meaner. "You know what I think? I think you've been scared since we left the trucks. I think you got Soldier Girl living in your head rent-free, and I think if you say one more word about how something ain't right, I'm gonna start wondering why I ever let you carry a gun on my mountain." Marcus shut his mouth. But he was right. He was more right than he could possibly have known, because at that exact moment, 400 yards up the ridge and 30 feet off the ground, in a hide she'd woven into the crotch of an old Douglas fir, over the course of 2 patient weeks, Ava Carter was watching him through a spotting scope and thinking with a flicker of something almost like respect. "There he is, that's the one. He can feel it. Good." She wrote it in her notebook, a single line, 9:04 a.m. "The young one at the rear is aware. She's begun to lose the herd already, and it's not even noon." She had not moved in 3 hours. She would not move for 3 more. This was the part the men could never have imagined, the part that separated what she was from what they thought she was. They imagined, if they imagined anything, a woman crouched behind her cabin with a rifle waiting nervously for them to come to her. They could not have conceived of the truth that she had been out here in the cold dark since before they'd woken up, that she'd watched them eat breakfast through her scope from a mile off, that she had counted them and named them in her mind and assigned to each of them a private prediction about how and when he would break. Breck last, Dutch second to last out of spite, Cole in the middle when his youth caught up with him, Randy early because loyalty without brains is the most fragile thing there is. And Marcus was the variable. Marcus knew. And a man who knows either breaks first from the sheer weight of the knowing, or he survives the longest, because knowing is the beginning of wisdom and wisdom is the beginning of leaving. She would find out which. She had time. The first thing she did to them was so small that it was almost gentle. She waited until they split up. They always split up. Hunters did, spreading out across a draw to push game toward the guns. Around 10 o'clock, Breck sent Cole and Randy up the east slope and kept Dutch and Marcus with him. And for the first time all morning, the 5 men were not in a single tight knot, but strung out across a quarter-mile of timber, each of them alone with the silence. And then Ava began to move their world. She'd rigged it weeks ago when she first understood what was coming. A system of tripwires and pulleys and counterweights, invisible, threaded through the timber along the game trails she knew they'd use, because she knew this mountain the way they only thought they did. A tug on a wire here dropped a stone there. A stone dropped there swung a branch somewhere else. Cause and effect separated by 50 yards of forest, so that the effect could never be traced back to the cause. She had learned this a long time ago, in a country she never named, from men who used it to make an enemy believe a ghost was hunting him. It worked on hardened insurgents. It would work on 5 drunk poachers who'd never been afraid of anything in their lives. Cole was picking his way up the east slope alone when he heard the footstep behind him. He spun rifle up. Nothing, just timber and shadow in the cold. "Randy," he called, "that you, nothing." He turned back around and he heard it again, a footstep, deliberate, unhurried, right behind him, close enough to touch. He spun again, faster, his heart suddenly loud in his ears. Nothing, nothing at all, no one there. "Quit playing," Cole said, and his voice came out higher than he meant it to. "Randy, I swear to God." The footstep came a third time, and this time it did not stop. This time it was followed by another and another, slow and steady and heavy, circling him, moving through the brush, just beyond the edge of what he could see. And Cole turned and turned and turned, and there was never anything there. And the footsteps kept coming, patient as a clock, until Cole did the thing that Ava had known he would do, the thing that separated the middle of the pack from the front. He ran. He ran downhill, crashing through the brush toward the sound of the others. And when he found Randy on the slope below, he grabbed him by the jacket with both hands, wild-eyed, and Randy said, "The hell's wrong with you?" And Cole couldn't answer at first, could only stand there shaking, and finally got out. There's somebody up there. There's somebody walking around. Up there. I heard him right behind me, walking. Well, did you see him? No, Then you didn't hear nothing. Randy shook him off annoyed, but Ava, watching through the scope, saw the way Randy's own eyes flicked up the slope after he said it. Saw the doubt land. 10:18 a.m., she wrote. 2 down the trail of belief. The middle one ran. She did not smile. She had stopped smiling at things like this years ago, but she noted with the cold precision that was all she had left where satisfaction used to be, that it was going exactly the way she'd planned, and that it was still early and that she had barely begun. She let them stew for an hour after that. That was the art of it. You did a thing, and then you did nothing, and the nothing was worse than the thing, because the human mind cannot tolerate an unexplained event. It worries at it. It turns it over. Cole would spend the next hour trying to convince himself he'd imagined the footsteps and the failing would do more damage than the footsteps ever could. Breck, when they told him, was contemptuous. You heard a deer, he said. You heard the wind. You heard your own damn boots and got yourself worked up like a little kid. But even Breck, Ava saw, had gone quieter. Even Breck had started once or twice to glance over his shoulder at nothing. Around noon, they stopped to eat, all 5 of them, together again, sitting on a fallen log in a small clearing, and Ava did the second thing. She'd been in position above the clearing for 20 minutes, having moved for the first time all morning, a slow, silent, agonizing repositioning that took her the better part of an hour to cover 200 yards, because moving without being seen or heard is not a thing you do quickly. It is a thing you do the way water moves, finding the low places, taking the time the terrain demands. Now she lay above them, closer than any of them would ever have believed possible. Close enough to hear Breck telling a story about his father, and she waited until they were all eating, all relaxed, all sure that the morning scares were behind them. And then she took a small stone and she threw it, not at them, past them, into the brush on the far side of the clearing so that it landed with a sharp crack and a rustle, and all 5 men came off that log at once, rifles swinging toward the sound. There, Cole said. You hear that? You hear it now. They stared into the brush. Nothing moved. Just an animal, Dutch said, but his voice had an edge now, too. Ava waited. She counted to 60 in her head, slow, letting them almost relax, letting them almost sit back down, and then she threw the second stone into the brush on the opposite side behind them so that they spun the other way, and this time even Breck flinched. 2 of them, Randy said. There's 2 of them, 1 on each side. There ain't nobody, Breck snapped, but the certainty had gone out of it. Stones fall, rocks come loose. It's a mountain, it makes noise. Ava threw the third stone directly into the middle of them so that it landed at their feet in the dirt between their boots, out of a clear sky with no one anywhere near. And the 5 men leapt back as if it had been a snake, and for one long, frozen second, not one of them said anything at all because there was no explaining it. There was no one on the mountain who could have thrown a stone into the center of their circle. There was no high ground close enough. There was no one there. And yet the stone lay in the dirt at their feet, undeniable, impossible. And every one of them was thinking the same thing that no one would say. Marcus said it. I told you, Marcus whispered. I told you all morning. There's somebody up here with us, and they're good. They're real good, and they're not trying to hunt deer. He looked around the clearing at the timber, pressing in on every side at the 1,000 places a person could be. They're hunting us. Shut up, Breck said, but it came out weak. You saw that stone. You all saw it. Where'd it come from? Breck, you tell me where it came from. Nobody could. And that was the moment, 12:40 in the afternoon, Ava noted it precisely, that the group first began to come apart. Not physically. They were all still there, still standing in the clearing, still 5 men with 5 rifles. But something had broken between them. Some shared certainty that had held them together since the trucks, and Ava had broken it with 3 small stones in a morning of patience. And she watched from above as the crack ran through them, and she felt nothing. And she wrote it down. What none of them understood, what none of them could understand because they had never been taught the thing she'd been taught, was that she was not trying to frighten them randomly. She was doing something much more precise. She was teaching them one impossible event at a time that the rules they lived by did not apply on this mountain. That cause did not lead to effect. That a stone could come from nowhere. That footsteps could exist without feet. She was dismantling brick by brick the foundation of ordinary reality that a human mind stands on. And once that foundation was gone, once a man could no longer trust that the world worked the way it was supposed to, then fear had a clear road straight into the deepest part of him, and there was nothing left to stop it. They didn't finish their lunch. They packed up fast, all of them, talking at once, and Breck, to reassert control, to prove to himself as much as to them that he was still the man in charge, made a decision that Ava had been counting on him making. "We're not leaving," he announced. "You hear me? We are not leaving. Some kids, some locals, somebody's out here messing with us, throwing rocks, playing games, trying to scare us off. And you know what that tells me? That tells me it's working. That tells me somebody wants us gone bad enough to sneak around in the woods like a coward. Well, I don't run from cowards. My daddy didn't run and I don't run." He racked his rifle, loud, deliberate. "We're going to hunt this mountain till dark like we planned. And if whoever's out there wants to keep throwing rocks, they can keep throwing rocks right up until I catch them, and then we'll see how funny they think it is." It was exactly what Ava had wanted him to say, because now they were committed. Now they would stay until dark. And after dark, the mountain would stop being a place where 5 armed men hunted deer and would become a place where 5 terrified men tried to find their way home in the black. And that was the place she had been building toward all along. She let them hunt through the afternoon. She let them spread out again because Breck's pride demanded it, because he had to prove he wasn't afraid. And she worked them one at a time, patient, invisible, relentless. Randy was next. Randy had wandered off along a game trail on the north slope alone, still shaken from the morning, and Ava let him get good and isolated a quarter mile from the nearest of the others before she began. She had rigged this trail too. A pole on a wire and 40 yards ahead of Randy, a doe decoy she'd built and positioned weeks ago, a crude thing but convincing enough at a distance in bad light, jerked into motion a flash of brown and white through the brush. Randy froze, then he grinned. A deer. A real deer, finally, and he was the one who'd found it. He raised his rifle, sighted, and squeezed off a shot. The doe dropped. Randy whooped and hurried forward through the brush, forgetting his fear in the excitement of the kill. Forgetting everything, and when he got to the spot where the deer had fallen, there was no deer. There was no blood. There was nothing there at all except a patch of disturbed leaves, and laid carefully in the center of it, one of Ava's private property signs, one of the ones Breck had torn down that very morning, propped up against a stump so that it faced him, so that it was the first thing he saw. "You are being recorded." Randy stared at it. His mouth had gone dry. He'd seen the deer. He'd shot the deer. He'd watched it fall. And now there was no deer. There had never been a deer. There was only a sign that he had personally watched Breck tear down and throw in the mud 4 hours ago, and it was standing here, upright, clean, waiting for him in a place no one could have known he'd be. "No," Randy said out loud to no one. No, I saw it, I shot it, The footsteps started behind him. Slow, deliberate, circling. Randy did not turn around this time. Randy could not turn around. Some animal part of his brain had understood that whatever was making the footsteps was not something he wanted to see, and he stood frozen with the sign in front of him and the footsteps behind him, and then a voice came out of the timber, low and calm, and utterly without emotion. A woman's voice, close, so close, and it said only 4 words. "You were warned, Randy." That she knew his name broke him. Randy screamed and ran. He threw his rifle down and ran blind, crashing through the brush. And Ava followed him for 100 yards through the timber without making a sound. A shadow at his back, letting him hear just enough the snap of a twig, the whisper of movement to keep the terror at a full boil. And then she peeled off and let him run the rest of the way alone. And he ran straight into Dutch and Cole, down in the draw, and collapsed, sobbing, incoherent. And it took them 10 minutes to get anything out of him at all. "It knew my name," was all he could say over and over. "It knew my name. There was a deer, and then there wasn't, and then the sign was there, and it knew my name." 1:50 in the afternoon, Ava wrote back in her hide, her breathing already slowed to nothing. "The loyal one is gone. He'll never come back up this mountain as long as he lives. 3 left who still believe, and one of them is only pretending." She meant Marcus. Marcus had stopped believing hours ago. Marcus was at that moment standing a little apart from the others, watching Randy come undone and doing arithmetic of a very different kind than the arithmetic Breck had done in his yard. Breck had counted 5 against 1. Marcus was counting something else. Marcus was counting the ways this could end, and every single way he counted ended badly, and he had come to a decision that he was too afraid to say out loud. He was going to leave. Not now. Not yet. Breck would never allow it, and Marcus wasn't sure he could find his way off the mountain alone in daylight, let alone if the dark caught him. But the moment the group turned to go, the moment Breck finally gave the word, Marcus was going to peel away and get to the trucks and drive down and never ever come back. And if Breck wanted his money, he could come find him in town in the daylight, in the world of ordinary things where mountains didn't eat men alive. That decision saved Marcus's life. But he didn't know that yet. Breck, when he finally got the story of the vanishing deer and the sign and the voice that knew Randy's name, did something that Ava had not entirely predicted, and she watched it with genuine interest because it told her something about him she hadn't known. He got angry, not scared angry, because Breck Holloway's entire self, the whole architecture of the man, was built on the bedrock belief that he was the most dangerous thing on any mountain he stood on, and the events of the day had begun, for the first time in his life, to suggest otherwise. And rather than let that suggestion in, rather than feel the fear that any sane man would have felt, Breck did what men like Breck always do. He converted the fear into rage, because rage felt like strength and fear felt like weakness, and Breck would rather die than feel weak. "That's it," he said, low and shaking. "That's it. You want to play, we'll play." He grabbed Randy by the collar and hauled him to his feet. Where'd you hear the voice?" "Show me, right now. We are going to go up there, and we are going to find this bitch, and I am going to—" He stopped himself, breathing hard. "Show me where." "Breck, no. Show me where." And that, too, was exactly what Ava had wanted. Because a frightened enemy who runs is a problem solved, but an enraged enemy who charges is a gift. Because rage makes a man stupid, and stupid makes a man predictable. And predictable was the only thing Ava had ever needed from anyone. She let Breck lead them up the slope toward the place where Randy had heard the voice. She let him charge up there, full of fury, all four of them behind him now. Randy dragged along, shaking Marcus at the very back, and she had, of course, rigged the whole slope in advance days ago, because she had known from the moment she'd seen the kind of man Breck was, that his pride would not let him leave, that he would have to come find her. That his need to be the most dangerous thing on the mountain would drive him straight into the one part of the mountain that she'd made most dangerous of all. They came up the slope, hot and loud, and Ava sprang the whole thing at once. A tripwire dropped a curtain of stones down the draw behind them, with a sound like a landslide, and all four spun toward it, and while they were turned, a second wire released a swinging deadfall ahead of them that crashed down across the trail with enough force to snap saplings, and they spun back, and a third wire and a fourth, so that for 30 seconds the mountain seemed to come alive around them on every side, crashing and falling and moving in ambush with no ambusher. An attack from 100 directions at once by an enemy who was nowhere, and the four men lost their minds completely. Cole fired. He fired blind into the timber at nothing, at everything working the bolt, and firing again, screaming, and Dutch grabbed him and wrestled the rifle down before he shot one of them, and Randy was on the ground with his hands over his head, and Breck was turning and turning and turning with his rifle up, roaring, "Where are you? Where are you? Come out and face me." And the mountain gave him back only the echo of his own voice, fading mocking, and then silence. Total silence. The crashing stopped all at once. The stones settled. The dust such as there was drifted down. And the four men stood in the sudden, quiet chest, heaving ears ringing, and understood each of them in his own way that they had just fought a battle against nothing and lost. Marcus was not there. That was the moment they realized it. In the chaos, Marcus had done the thing he'd decided to do. He'd slipped away downhill toward the trucks, and he was already 300 yards gone, moving fast and quiet, not looking back. And when Breck turned and counted his men and came up one short, something happened in his face that Ava, watching, had been waiting all day to see. The first true crack. Not anger, not pride, fear. Real fear, the kind Breck had spent his whole life outrunning, finally catching up to him. Because if the mountain could take a man, if a grown man could simply vanish out of the middle of the group without a sound, then Breck was not the most dangerous thing. Here had never been the most dangerous thing here, and every certainty he'd built his life on was a lie. "Marcus," Breck said, then louder. "Marcus," then screaming it, his voice cracking, "Marcus!" Nothing answered. "It took him," Randy moaned from the ground. "It took him. It took Marcus. It's gonna take both of us." Shut up, shut up. But Breck's voice was shaking now unmistakably, and Dutch heard it, and Cole heard it, and something in the group shifted again because the keystone had cracked, and when the keystone cracks, the whole arch feels it. Ava, 200 yards away and 30 feet up, watched Marcus disappear down the mountain and made a decision. She let him go. She could have stopped him. She could have turned him back with a footstep and a whisper the way she turned Randy. But she'd been watching Marcus all day, and she'd seen him try to warn them at the trucks and try again in the clearing, and she'd seen him decide to leave, and she'd understood something about him that mattered to whatever was left of her conscience. Marcus was the one who'd said no. Marcus was the one who'd looked up at the tree line and felt her and told the truth about it, over and over, and been shouted down every time. He'd owed money and been afraid and made a bad choice to come up here, but he was not Breck. He was not part of the thing that had made this mountain necessary. And Ava had promised herself in the dark the night before that she would give every chance. Marcus was taking his. She would not take it from him. 2:30 p.m. she wrote, "Let the reluctant one go. He warned them 3 times. He's earned the valley. 4 left, and the light is going." The light was going. That was the thing the 4 remaining men had not yet fully reckoned with, and it was the thing Ava had been building toward all day. It was late October at altitude. The sun was already dropping toward the western ridge, and when it went down, it would go down fast, and the temperature would fall with it from raw to freezing in an hour, and the 4 men were still deep on her land. And disoriented, exhausted, a mile and a half from trucks they now weren't sure they could find, with a leader whose confidence had cracked and a group whose faith in that leader had cracked with it. Breck tried to hold it together. Ava had to give him that. He tried. He got Randy up off the ground. He got Cole calmed down. He gathered them and pointed them downhill toward where the trucks should be, and he said in a voice he was fighting hard to keep steady, "We're leaving. We're going to the trucks. We stay together. We go straight down. We do not stop. We do not split up, and we do not run. You hear me? Nobody runs. We walk out of here together like men." It was good sense. It was in fact exactly what they should have done, and if they had done it, if they'd walked straight downhill in a tight group in the last of the light, they'd have made it to the trucks and driven home, and the story would have ended there. 4 badly scared men who never hunted that mountain again. But Ava was not going to let them walk out in the light. She had one more thing to do before the dark came, one more piece to move, and it was the cruelest piece of all because it was aimed not at their bodies or even really at their fear, but at the thing that held them together, at the trust between them, the last thing they had. She'd been saving it all day. She'd recorded Breck that morning from her hide with a small, directional microphone, recorded him at the spring, laughing, saying the thing about the soldier girl, and she'd recorded other things too. Snatches of the men talking when they thought no one could hear, and she'd spent the quiet hours of the afternoon in her hide with a small speaker and a plan. As the 4 men started downhill in the failing light, tight and scared, and finally doing the smart thing, Ava keyed the speaker she'd hidden in the timber ahead of them, and Breck's own voice came out of the forest. "There's 5 of us," said Breck's voice from the trees clear as day, "and there's 1 of her." The 4 men stopped dead. It was Breck's voice. It was unmistakably Breck's voice coming out of the timber 20 yards ahead of them, saying a thing Breck had said in his own yard days ago, a thing none of the others had even been present to hear. Cole turned and looked at Breck. So did Dutch. So did Randy. "How's it got your voice?" Cole said slowly. "How's it out there into the trees talking in your voice, Breck?" "When'd you say that?" I don't. That's you. That's your voice. It said there's 5 of us and there's 1 of her. When'd you say that, Breck? Who were you talking to?" And Ava watched from her hide as the thing she'd built all day finally came fully apart, as 4 terrified, exhausted, half-frozen men turned on each other in the dying light, as the trust that had held them together dissolved into suspicion, as Cole and Dutch stepped back from Breck, with fear in their eyes, wondering suddenly if their leader had made some deal, if this was some setup, if Breck knew more than he was saying. Because the alternative that the mountain itself had learned to speak in Breck's voice was so much worse that their minds reached for any explanation but that one. "It's a trick," Breck said, desperate now, pleading almost. And the pleading was the final crack because Breck Holloway had never in his life pleaded with anyone. "It's a recording. She's got a speaker out there. She recorded me. She's playing it back to turn us against each other. Don't you see what she's doing?" "When she record you?" Dutch said. When she get close enough to record you, Breck, 'cause I have been with you all day, and I never seen no woman, and I never heard you say that. So either she was close enough to record you, and none of us ever saw her, which means she can get close to any of us anytime, and we'd never know. Or you're lying, and you said that to somebody, and you brought us up here into a trap. Breck had no answer. There was no good answer. Both possibilities were true in a sense, and both were unbearable, and Ava had known that, had built the whole thing so that there was no answer, so that the truth would eat them either way. 3:15, she wrote, the last thing that held them is gone. Now they're just four frightened men who don't trust each other alone on a mountain in the dark. She looked west at the sun sitting on the ridge, minutes from gone. She capped her pen. She'd written enough for now. The work was almost done. She had not fired a shot. She had not touched one of them. She had not technically done a single thing that any court in the country could call a crime. She'd thrown some stones on her own land, moved some props, played some recordings, and every one of those men had come onto her property with a gun after being warned in writing in daylight with the sheriff as her witness. If they died tonight, they would die of the cold and the dark and the terrain and their own panic, and the coroner would write exposure, and it would be true. But Ava knew as she watched the sun touch the ridge and the first real dark begin to pool in the draws below her, that true and honest were not the same word. She knew what she had done. She would always know. She had taken 5 confident men, and without laying a hand on them, she had reached into each of them and found the thing they were most afraid of and made it real. And she had done it with the patient practiced skill of someone who had done it before in other mountains to other men. For reasons the country had called good at the time. She had come to this mountain to stop being that person. And here she was, in a hide in a tree, watching 4 men come apart below her, more herself than she'd been in years. She did not know yet how she felt about that. She would have years to figure it out. For now there was only the work, and the light was almost gone, and the coldest, darkest, longest part of it was about to begin. Below her, in the last gray minutes of the 4 men stood frozen in a loose, broken circle, no longer a group, each of them alone now, even standing shoulder to shoulder, and Breck Holloway looked up at the darkening timber all around him, at the 1,000 black spaces between the trees, where anything could be where his own voice had come from, where a stone could fall out of a clear sky and a deer could vanish and a man could disappear without a sound, and for the first time in his entire life, Breck Holloway understood that he was going to have to survive the night, and that he was not at all sure he could. "We go down," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper now, all the roar gone out of it. "We go down and we don't stop. Right now, before it's full dark. Come on, come on." And the 4 of them started down the mountain in the last of the light, too fast, not together anymore, but strung out and stumbling, each man watching his own patch of shadow, each man alone with the thing Ava had planted in him. And above them, the sun slipped behind the ridge, and the dark came down over the mountain like a hand closing. And somewhere in that dark, unseen, unhurried, exactly where she meant to be, Ava Carter came down out of her tree without a sound and began at last to move. The dark did not come gradually on that mountain. It came all at once, the way it always does at altitude when the sun drops behind a ridge. One moment there was gray light enough to see the trail, and the next there was nothing. A blackness so total that Breck Holloway could not see his own hand when he raised it in front of his face, and he stopped so suddenly that Cole walked into his back and both men nearly went down. "Flashlight," Breck said. "Everybody get your lights out, now." They fumbled in their packs. Cole's light came on first, a thin white beam that seemed to be swallowed by the dark rather than pushing it back, and in that beam, the timber looked completely different than it had in daylight. Closer, denser, every trunk, a place a person could hide behind. Dutch got his light on next. Randy's hands were shaking so badly he dropped his and it rolled away down the slope and went out, and he made a small broken sound and didn't go after it. "Where's the trail?" Cole said, sweeping his beam across the ground. "Breck, where's the trail? I don't see the trail." And here was the thing they did not know, the thing Ava had been counting on since she'd first walked this property line in silence months ago. There was no clear trail. There had never been a clear trail down this face of the mountain, not one a man could follow in the dark. In daylight, with the whole slope visible, they'd been able to pick their way down by reading the terrain. But at night, with their world shrunk to a 10-foot circle of failing flashlight, they had no way to tell the game trails from the deer paths, from the dead-end draws that ended in cliffs. The mountain that had been merely difficult in the light became in the dark a maze, and it was a maze Ava had spent months memorizing every turn of it, every drop, every place where a tired man in a panic would naturally choose the wrong way. 6:40 p.m. she wrote, though she wrote it by feel now in the dark, her pen finding the page from long practice. Full dark. They've lost the trail. From here the mountain does most of the work. I barely have to touch them. She was below them now, and to their left, moving parallel to their descent, close enough to hear every word they said. She had come down out of her tree the moment the light failed, and she moved through the black timber, the way she moved through everything without hurry, without sound, placing each foot by feel, reading the slope through the soles of her boots. She had night vision, a small monocular she'd carried up the mountain days ago, and cached in her hide, and through it the four men had blazed in the dark like torches, their body heat, their flashlights, their panic practically visible in the way they moved. She could see them. They could see nothing. And that asymmetry was the whole war had always been the whole war was the thing she had built her entire life around long before she'd ever heard the name Breck Holloway. Breck made his first fatal decision at 6:50. Downhill, he said. We just keep going downhill. Downhill's the trucks. We can't get lost if we just keep going down. It sounded like sense. It was not sense. Ava knew this mountain, and she knew that the fall line, the direction straight down, did not lead to the trucks. It led away from them, angling east into a system of draws that grew steeper and rougher the further you went, that funneled a descending man deeper into the roughest part of her land toward a series of drops and a cold creek at the bottom that ran through a slot too narrow and too steep to climb back out of easily. The trucks were down and to the west along a shoulder of the ridge that you had to traverse to reach. Going straight down felt right. Going straight down was the mistake. And Breck, exhausted and frightened and desperate to be doing something, made it and led his three shaking men off the shoulder and down into the wrong drainage. And every step took them further from the trucks and deeper into the part of the mountain Ava had made her own. She did not stop him. Why would she? He was doing her work for her. She followed them down for 20 minutes in silence, letting the mountain do it, letting the terrain wear them down, letting the cold get into them. And then when she judged the moment right, when they'd committed fully to the wrong drainage, when there was no easy way back, she began again. She started with Cole because Cole had the only working flashlight now that mattered, the brightest one, the one holding the group together. And a group with light is a group that can still function. And Ava intended for them to stop functioning. She'd rigged this drainage too, of course. Not as heavily as the upper slopes, she'd had less certainty they'd come this way, but enough. A single wire strung at ankle height across the game trail they were following, tied off to a spring-loaded branch. As Cole led the group down, his light on the ground, watching his feet, his boot caught the wire and the branch whipped across the trail and struck the flashlight out of his hand. It didn't break. That would have been too clean. It flew out of his grip and landed in the brush 10 feet off the trail while I'm still shining, pointing back up at them, so that suddenly the four men were lit from below and from the side by their own light, throwing their shadows huge and monstrous up into the timber. And Cole yelled and lunged after it, and Dutch grabbed him. Don't leave the trail. Don't go off the trail. And for a few seconds, all four of them stood, arguing in the strange upward light, while the flashlight lay in the brush just out of reach, and none of them dared to go get it. And while they argued, Ava reached out of the dark, picked up the flashlight, and turned it off. The dark slammed down. The silence that followed was the worst thing yet, because they had all seen it, or thought they'd seen it, in the chaos of the shadows. The light had not just gone out. The light had been picked up, had risen up off the ground, and swung and gone dark. And there was no explaining that, no mechanical failure that picks a flashlight up off the ground. And the four men stood in the absolute black and understood that the thing hunting them had just been close enough to touch their light. Close enough to touch them, and not one of them had seen it, and not one of them had heard it. It's right here, Randy whispered. It's right here with us. Oh God, it's right here. Dutch, your light, get your slide on. Dutch's light came on shaking and swept the timber wildly, and there was nothing. Of course, there was nothing. Ava was already 20 feet away and behind a trunk, invisible, waiting. 7:15 p.m., she wrote, down to one working light and four men who now know I can reach them whenever I choose. The knowledge is worse than the dark. Let it work on them. And it did work on them. Ava understood something about fear that these men were only now beginning to learn. that the anticipation of a thing is almost always worse than the thing itself, and that a mind left alone in the dark with a fear will torture itself far more thoroughly than any torture ever could. She did not need to do much now. She needed only to remind them every so often that she was there, a snapped twig, a whisper of movement, a small stone rolling down the slope past them out of the dark above, and then let their own minds fill the silences in between with horrors far worse than anything she could have staged. She gave them 10 minutes of that, 10 minutes of stumbling downhill in the shaking beam of Dutch's single flashlight, each of them flinching at every sound, real or imagined, the group so tight now that they kept tripping over each other. And then she took Dutch's light too. This time she did it differently. This time she waited until Dutch, sweeping his beam nervously across the timber, pointed it for just a moment away from the trail, and in that moment she was directly ahead of them on the trail on Arik in the dark, and she simply spoke. "Turn it off, Dutch." Dutch froze. The voice had come from directly in front of him. From the pool of dark, his light was pointed away from a woman's voice, calm, close, patient. "You don't need it," the voice said. "It's not helping you. It's just showing me where you are. Turn it off, and I might let you rest." "Who are you?" Dutch said, and his voice broke on it. "What do you want? We'll leave, okay? We'll leave. We'll never come back. Just let us go down. Let us get to the trucks." "You're going the wrong way for the trucks," the voice said, and that simple statement of fact, delivered so calmly, was more terrifying than any threat, because it meant she knew exactly where they were and exactly where they were trying to go and exactly how badly they'd failed to get there. "You've been going the wrong way for half an hour. The trucks are behind you now, and above you, and to the west. You'll never find them in the dark going down. You're just going deeper into my land. But you know that already, don't you, Dutch? You've known for a while, you just didn't want to say it out loud." Dutch's light went out, not because she took it, because Dutch turned it off. Because some part of him had believed that the light was only showing her where he was, and in his exhausted terror, he'd grasped at the one instruction she'd given him: turn it off, and I might let you rest, like a drowning man grasping at anything at all. "Dutch, what are you doing?" Cole hissed in the dark. "Turn it back on, Dutch, turn it back on." She said, "I don't care what she said. Turn it back." But when Dutch fumbled the switch again, nothing happened. The light was dead. Whether Ava had done something to it in the dark or the cold had simply killed the batteries, none of them would ever know. And it didn't matter, because the effect was the same. 4 men in the total dark, in the deep cold deep, on the wrong part of a mountain. They couldn't navigate, hunted by a voice that knew their names and their plans and their fears. With no light and no trail and no leader anyone still trusted. 7:40 p.m., Ava wrote. Both lights gone. Now it's just the dark, the cold, and their own minds. This is where they break for good. Randy broke first, as she'd predicted from the very beginning. Loyalty without brains is the most fragile thing there is, and Randy's whole self had been built on being Breck's man, on the certainty that Breck knew what to do, that Breck would get them out, and now Breck was just a voice in the dark that shook as badly as his own. Randy started to cry. Not quietly, great heaving sobs, and then he started to pray out loud. The half-remembered prayers of a childhood he hadn't thought about in 30 years. And then he stopped praying and started begging the dark, begging, the voice begging Ava, whom he could not see and had never seen. "Please," Randy sobbed into the black. "Please, I got kids. I got 2 little girls. Please, I never meant nothing by it. It was just hunting. It was just, please let me go home. Please, I'll never come back. I swear to God, I'll never." And Ava in the dark, 20 feet away, listening to a man beg for his life over a mountain, and some deer felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt sick. It came over her all at once, unbidden, unwelcome. Because Randy was not a good man, he'd fouled her spring and shot deer on her land and laughed at her signs. But he was a small man, a stupid, loyal, frightened man with 2 little girls at home, and he was on his knees in the dark begging a ghost for his life. And Ava had made herself into that ghost on purpose, with skill, with patience, drawing on everything a country had once taught her to do to human minds. And for one terrible moment, kneeling in the dark, listening to Randy weep, Ava was not on a mountain in Montana at all. She was somewhere else, years ago, in another dark, listening to another man beg, in a language she'd been trained just enough to understand, and she had done then what she'd been ordered to do, and she had carried it every day since, and it was the exact reason she had come to this mountain to disappear. She had told herself this was different. She had told herself these men had chosen it, that they'd been warned that she was giving every chance. And all of that was true. But kneeling in the dark, she understood with sudden brutal clarity that true was not the same as clean, that she had reached back into the cold place she'd sworn never to visit again and pulled out the old tools and used them. And that no amount of justification changed what she was doing to the mind of the sobbing man in front of her. She almost stopped. She came closer than anyone would ever know to standing up out of the dark, turning on a light and saying, "Enough. It's over. Follow me. I'll take you down." But then Breck spoke, and Breck saved her from her mercy the way cruel men so often save you from your mercy if you only wait. "Get up!" Breck snarled at Randy in the dark. "Get up off your knees, you sniveling. Get up. You're embarrassing yourself. It's a woman. It's one woman with a speaker and some tricks, and you're down there crying like a baby, giving her exactly what she wants. Get up before I make you get up." And there it was. Even now, even lost and freezing and terrified. In the dark, Breck Holloway's instinct was contempt, was cruelty, was to grind the weakest man under his heel, to make himself feel strong. Even now, he had learned nothing. Even now, if Ava had stood up and offered to lead them down, Breck would have taken it as proof he'd won, would have followed her out and told the story at the bar for years, the time some soldier girl tried to scare him off his mountain and lost her nerve. The sickness in Ava's gut turned cold and went still. No, she thought. Not for you. Randy might have earned mercy. Randy maybe if he had been alone. But mercy given to the group was mercy given to Breck, and Breck had not earned one single thing except exactly what was coming to him, and Ava rose from beside Randy and moved away through the dark and let the mountain go on doing its work. But she made a note in her mind, one she would keep. Randy she would let live. Randy she would guide when the time came, not out of forgiveness, but out of the last thread of something in herself she was not willing to let these men take from her. Randy had 2 little girls. Randy would go home. She didn't know yet how she'd manage it, but she'd manage it because the alternative was to become fully the thing she was pretending she wasn't, and she was not quite ready to pay that price. 8:10 p.m. she wrote, her hands going numb now. Even through her gloves, because she was feeling the cold too. She was human too, however much these men had stopped believing it. The cold is the real enemy now for all of us. I have hours yet. They have less than they think. The cold was becoming the whole story. Ava had known it would. This was the peace the men had never planned for, the peace their arrogance had blinded them to. They'd come up for a day's hunting in late October and packed like men who'd be home for supper. And now they were going to spend the whole night out in freezing temperatures, without shelter, without fire, soaked through with the sweat of their panic. And the cold was going to do to their bodies what Ava had done to their minds. It was going to take them apart piece by piece. The first sign was the shivering, which had started as fear, and was now becoming something else deeper, the body's desperate attempt to generate heat. Then came the stumbling, the loss of coordination as the cold reached the muscles. Then, and Ava knew this stage well, had been trained, and it had survived it herself in a cold weather course 2 decades ago that had nearly killed her. Then would come the confusion, the poor decisions, and finally, cruelly, the paradoxical warmth. The fatal feeling of being too hot, the urge to take off clothing, the sitting down to rest that a hypothermic man never gets up from. She could see it beginning in Cole. Cole was young and strong and had been the group's engine of panic all day, and all that panic had burned through his reserves faster than the others. He was moving strangely now in the green glow of her night vision, his motions jerky and wrong, and when he spoke, his words had started to slur. "I'm tired," Cole said. "I'm going to sit down, just for a minute, Don't you sit down," Dutch said sharply and grabbed him. Dutch at least understood. Dutch had done some winter work in the oil fields up north and knew what sitting down in the cold meant. "You sit down, you don't get up. Keep moving. Keep moving. Cole, come on." They stumbled on, and Ava, watching, made another decision because the situation had changed and she had not planned for men to actually die. Not really, not when she was honest with herself. She had planned to break them. She had planned to send them off her mountain, so shattered they'd never return, and so afraid they'd tell everyone who'd listen to stay away. She had planned a legend, not a body count. But the cold did not care about her plans. The cold was going to start killing them whether she wanted it or not, and now she had to decide in the dark how far she was willing to let it go. This was the twist she had not seen coming. The one no amount of planning had prepared her for that. The hardest part of the whole night would not be breaking these men, but deciding whether to let the mountain finish what she'd started. She had built herself as the hunter. And now, with the cold doing her work, she found that being the hunter and being the executioner were two different things, and she stood at the line between them in the dark and understood that she had to choose, and that whatever she chose, she would carry for the rest of her life, just like everything else. 8:40 p.m. She did not write it down. Her hands were too cold and her mind was too full. She chose. She would not let them die. Not all of them. That was the line, and she found it in herself the same way she'd found every other line in her life, not through softness, but through a hard, cold accounting of what she could and couldn't live with. She could live with breaking them. She could live with the fear, the legend, the years of nightmares she'd given them. She could not live with 4 bodies, could not live with Randy's 2 little girls, could not live with becoming on her own mountain. In her own country, the exact things she'd fled to the ends of the earth to stop being. But she also would not simply rescue them. She would not turn on a light and lead them out like a shepherd. Because a rescue would undo everything, would tell Breck he'd won, would put her face to the voice, would trade the legend for a woman who could be identified, questioned, blamed. There had to be a third path. There was always a third path if you were disciplined enough to find it. So Ava did the most dangerous thing she'd done all night. She got ahead of them, moving fast and silent through terrain she knew by heart, and she began to shape their descent, not with terror now, but with the opposite. Where before she'd driven them deeper into the wrong drainage, now she began invisibly to herd them back toward the shoulder that led to the trucks. A stone rolled down on the left turned them right. A whisper of movement ahead turned them back. A snapped branch behind pushed them forward. She was still the ghost. She was still the hunter in the dark. But she had reversed the current, and the 4 stumbling, frozen men believing they were still fleeing, still lost, still hunted, were in fact being guided, steered by the very fear she'd planted back toward the one path that would save their lives. They never knew. That was the beauty of it, the terrible, elegant beauty. They would spend the rest of their lives believing they'd barely escaped a mountain that wanted them dead, when in truth the mountain in the person of the woman they never saw had reached down at the last moment and carried them out. The fear that had nearly killed them became the thing that saved them, and they would never know it, and that ignorance was itself part of the legend she was building. Let them think they escaped. Let them think it was luck or or their own toughness, anything but the truth. The truth was hers to keep. 9:20 p.m. Cole went down. He simply stopped and folded mid-stride, and this time Dutch couldn't hold him up. And Cole sat down hard in the frozen leaves and started in the slurred, dreamy voice of deep hypothermia to talk about how warm it was, how he was going to just rest here, where it was so nice and warm. And he started pulling at his jacket, trying to take it off, and Dutch was screaming at him, and Randy was crying again, and Breck stood over them, useless, out of ideas, out of everything. The roar finally gone completely. Just a shaking, frozen man in the dark who had run out of the one thing he'd always had, which was the certainty that he was in charge. And Ava understood that if she wanted Cole to live, she had to break her own rule. She had to let herself be, if not seen, then known. She had to intervene directly, because Cole was minutes from death now, and no amount of hurting would save a man who wouldn't get up. And if she stayed in the dark and let her pride and her plan run their course, Cole would die in the leaves with his jacket half off, and she would have killed him as surely as if she'd fired the shot she'd promised herself she never would. So Ava made her final choice of the night. She reached into her pack and took out a road flare. She'd carried it for exactly this, for the possibility she'd refused to fully admit she was planning for. And she moved to a position on the shoulder on the correct path, 60 yards below the 4 men and directly between them and the trucks. And she struck the flare. It flared to life, blazing red in the absolute dark, an impossible burning eye in the black timber. And all 4 men saw it at once. "Light," Dutch breathed. "There's a light. Down there, Cole. Cole, look, there's a light." Ava let it burn for exactly 5 seconds. Long enough for all of them to see it, to fix its position, to understand that it was down, and to the west on the shoulder exactly where the trucks were. Long enough to give a dying group a direction and a reason to move. And then she dropped the flare into the wet leaves where it hissed and dawed, and she was gone back into the dark before the after image had even faded from their eyes. Where'd it go? Randy said. The light, where'd it? Down there, Dutch said, and there was something new in his voice now. Something Ava had not heard from any of them all night. Hope. It was down there, west, on the ridge shoulder. That's Breck. That's where the trucks are, ain't it? We've been going the wrong way. She said, we've been going the wrong way, and there's a light down there to the west. Get Cole up. Get him up. We're going toward the light. And Ava, 20 feet away in the dark, watched Dutch and Randy haul Cole to his feet, watch them get his jacket back on, watch them sling his arms over their shoulders, and start down toward where the flare had been, toward the shoulder, toward the trucks, toward the correct path she'd been herding them onto for the last hour. And she understood that she had done it. She had threaded the needle. She had broken them completely, given them a legend, kept her own face in the dark, and at the same time, in the same motion, saved their lives without a single one of them ever knowing they'd been saved. Except one of them might have known. Later, much later in a jail cell where he would end up for reasons that had nothing to do with this night, Dutch would tell a cellmate about the light in the dark, the light that appeared for exactly 5 seconds, pointing exactly the right way, and then vanished. And the cellmate would say, that sounds like somebody helped you. And Dutch would go quiet for a long time and then say, I think somebody did. I think the whole time somebody did. And I think she wanted us to think it was the mountain. But it wasn't the mountain. Mountains don't light flares. But that was later. For now, there were only 4 broken men stumbling toward a red light that had already gone out, carrying their dying friend, moving at last in the right direction, and above them and behind them and all around them, the unseen woman who had spent 12 hours taking them apart and who now, having decided they would live, faded back into the dark of her own mountain to watch them go. 10 p.m. The temperature kept dropping. Ava followed them down the last of it, silent guiding where she needed to with a swoon or a sound, and it took them 2 more brutal hours, 2 hours of frozen stumbling, agony, Cole fading in and out, Randy praying, Dutch grimly counting steps, Breck silent. Breck had gone, completely silent, somewhere back in the dark, had stopped giving orders, stopped arguing, stopped being the leader, had become just a man putting one foot in front of the other in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. But they made it. At 2 minutes after midnight, 18 hours after Breck Holloway had spat on Ava's warning sign and kicked it flat and led his men laughing onto her land, the 4 of them stumbled out of the timber onto the shoulder and found the logging road and found the trucks right where they'd left them, cold and dark and blessedly, impossibly real. They didn't cheer. They were far past cheering. Dutch and Randy loaded Cole into the cab and cranked the heater and worked on him with the desperate, clumsy focus of frozen men trying to save a friend, and Breck stood alone by his own truck for a long moment and turned and looked back up the black mountain he'd owned in his mind for 44 years. He couldn't see anything. Just the dark, just the trees, just the vast silent mass of the mountain giving nothing back. But he knew she was up there. He knew it the way an animal knows the thing that hunted it is still watching from the tree line. And Breck Holloway, who had never in his life been afraid of anything, who had never backed down, never apologized, never once believed there was a boundary in this world he couldn't cross. Breck Holloway looked up at that dark mountain and his lips moved, and he said one word so quietly that only he could hear it, and only Ava, watching from above through her scope, could read it on his lips. Sorry, Breck said to the mountain, to the dark, to the ghost he never saw. Then he got in his truck and he started the engine and he drove down off Ava Carter's mountain and never as long as he lived set foot on it again. And Ava, watching the taillights wind down the washed-out road until they vanished into the valley below, lowered her scope and closed her eyes and stood alone in the freezing dark on the mountain that was hers again. Finally completely hers, and did not feel the victory she had thought she'd feel. She felt only tired. Tired in a way that went down to the bone, down past the bone, into the place where she kept all the other nights like this one, the ones from before, the ones she'd come here to forget. She had won. She had protected her peace. She had given every chance, kept her promise not to kill, threaded every needle. By any measure she cared to name, she had won. So why, standing alone on her mountain in the dark, did she feel exactly the way she'd felt on all those other mountains in all those other years, like she'd lost something she was never going to get back? 12:20 a.m. She did not write it down. Some things she didn't write down. Some things she just carried. She turned and started the long walk back up to her cabin alone, the way she'd wanted it, the way she'd chosen. The mountain silent all around her and hers, and empty and quiet at last, as quiet as she dreamed it would be on the day she'd signed the papers and driven up here to disappear. She'd gotten exactly what she wanted. She was starting to understand that this was not the same thing as getting what she needed, and that the distance between those two things was the whole shape of her life, and that she had carried it up this mountain with her, because you always carry it with you, because there is no land remote enough and no fence high enough to keep it out. Behind her, far below in the valley, 4 trucks worth of broken men drove home in the dark toward a town that had no idea yet what had happened, toward a sheriff who would start getting phone calls before dawn, toward a story that was about to begin its long, slow transformation from a thing that happened into a thing people whispered. And ahead of her up the dark trail, her cabin waited cold and empty, exactly the way she'd left it. Ava Carter walked up toward it alone, and the mountain kept her secrets the way it would keep them for years to come. The phone calls started at 4:40 in the morning, and Sheriff Daniel Mercer knew before he even picked up the receiver that whatever it was bad, because nobody calls a sheriff at 4:40 in the morning about anything good. It was Marcus. Marcus had made it down off the mountain the afternoon before, had reached the trucks around 3:30, and found them all still there, which meant the others were still up there, and he'd sat in his own truck for a long time trying to decide what to do. He'd wanted to leave. Every instinct in him had screamed to just drive home and lock his door and pretend he'd never gone up there at all. But he'd sat in that truck as the light failed and the cold came down. And he'd thought about Randy's kids, and he'd thought about Cole being just a stupid, excited 26-year-old, and he'd thought about the fact that 4 men were still up on that mountain in the dark with the thing he'd felt watching them all day. And in the end, he couldn't do it. He couldn't just drive away. So he'd waited all night in his truck, engine running for warmth, headlights off, watching the black wall of the mountain jumping at every sound. And around midnight, he'd seen movement at the tree line, and 4 figures had come stumbling out onto the road, and he'd nearly wept with relief. And he'd started his engine and pulled up to help, and Breck had come at him. Not with a weapon, with his hands. Breck had come at Marcus's truck the second he saw who it was, screaming incoherent, blaming Marcus for leaving, blaming Marcus for the whole thing, as if Marcus's leaving had somehow caused it, as if the coward who'd run was responsible for what happened to the men who'd stayed. It made no sense, but Breck wasn't making sense anymore. Breck was a broken man looking for someone to break, and Marcus was there. And Marcus had taken one look at Breck's face, at the wild eyes, the shaking, the utter wreckage of the man, and had put his truck in reverse and gotten out of there, because whatever had happened up on that mountain had turned Breck Holloway into something Marcus didn't recognize and didn't want anywhere near him. He'd driven around for 4 hours, unable to go home, unable to sleep. And finally, at 4:40 in the morning, he'd called the only person he could think of. "Sheriff," Marcus said, and his voice was shaking. "Sheriff, it's Marcus Dell. Something happened up on the Carter Mountain. Something bad. I don't even know how to tell you what I saw, because I didn't see anything. That's the problem. Nobody saw anything. But I'm telling you, something's wrong with Breck and the others. Something happened up there, and I think you need to go check on them. Because I see Breck's face, and I have never in my life seen a man look like that." Mercer sat up in the dark. "Slow down. Start from the beginning. You went up on the Carter land yesterday, all of you." Yeah, I know we shouldn't have. I know it was her land. I told them all day something wasn't right." Marcus stopped, got control of himself. "Just come out, please. Something happened up there, and I don't think it's over." Mercer got dressed in the dark with a feeling in his chest like a stone. He thought about the woman in his office weeks ago with her folder full of measured footprints. He thought about what she'd said. "I've seen what happens when people finally run out of chances." He'd known sitting across from her that something was coming. He just hadn't known what. And now, pulling on his boots at 4:40 in the morning, he had the sick certainty that he was about to find out. 5:15 a.m. Mercer drove out to the Holloway place first, because it was closest, and what he found there was worse than anything Marcus had described. Breck's truck was in the yard, parked crooked, one door hanging open. The dome light burned down to nothing. And Breck was sitting on his own front porch steps in the freezing dark, still in his hunting clothes, not moving, just sitting, staring at the mountain. He'd been there for hours. His wife had found him there when she'd woken up, had tried to get him inside, and he wouldn't come, wouldn't answer her, wouldn't do anything but sit and stare. And she'd been standing in the doorway crying when Mercer pulled up. Danny, thank God, she said. I don't know what's wrong with him. He came home in the middle of the night and he won't talk. He won't come inside. He just sits there. He's freezing, Danny. He's been out here for hours and he won't even... I don't know what happened to him. What happened to my husband? Mercer crossed the yard slowly and crouched down in front of Breck. Breck Holloway, the loudest man in the county. The man who'd never backed down from anything, looked back at him with eyes that Mercer would remember for the rest of his life. There was nothing in them. Not fear exactly, not anymore. Something past fear. The eyes of a man who had seen the floor of the world drop out from under him and had not yet found anything to stand on. Breck, Mercer said gently, it's Danny. Can you hear me? Can you tell me what happened up there? Breck's lips moved. It took a moment for sound to come out. There was nothing there, Breck whispered. What do you mean, nothing? There was nothing there. Breck's voice cracked. That's the thing, Danny. There was nothing there all day and all night, and there was nothing there. No one shot at us. No one touched us. There was nothing there. He turned and looked up at Mercer, and his face crumpled like a child's. But it wasn't nothing, do you understand? There was nothing there, and it almost killed all of us. And I can't make those two things make sense. They don't make sense. There was nothing there, but it was the most dangerous thing I ever... He couldn't finish. He put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook, and Breck Holloway in front of the sheriff and his wife in the gray light of dawn wept like something inside him had broken and would never be put back together. Mercer had been a lawman for 30 years. He'd seen men break. He'd seen combat veterans and abuse survivors and people who'd lost everything, and he knew what a broken man looked like. And crouched there in the Holloway yard, he understood that whatever had happened on that mountain, it had not left a mark on Breck's body. It had left a mark somewhere much deeper in a place no doctor could reach and no report could describe. And Mercer felt the first cold touch of the thing he'd spend the next months chasing and never quite catch the understanding that a person could be destroyed without a single law being broken, without a single hand being laid on them, and that there might be no name for it and no charge to file and no way in the end to prove it had happened at all. 5:50 a.m. Cole was in the hospital. Dutch and Randy had driven him straight to the county medical center the night before, and the doctors had worked on him for hours, severe hypothermia, core temperature, down to a level that should have killed him, and they'd pulled him back from the edge. But it had been close, closer than close. When Mercer got there and found Dutch in the waiting room, gray-faced and hollow-eyed, he sat down across from him and said, "Tell me what happened." And Dutch tried, he really tried. But every time he opened his mouth to describe it, he found there was nothing to describe. "We went up to hunt," Dutch said slowly, staring at his own hands. "And things started happening. Little things. We'd hear footsteps and there'd be nobody there. Cole heard him first. We thought he was crazy. Then a rock came down out of nowhere right in the middle of us, and there was nowhere it could have come from. And then Randy shot a deer that wasn't there, and there was a voice and it knew his name." He stopped. "You hear how this sounds? You hear how crazy this sounds? Keep going." And then it got dark, and we tried to get down, and we couldn't find the trail, and every time we thought we knew where we were going, something turned us around. Lights got taken, just taken, right out of our hands. And there was a voice, a woman's voice, and it knew where we were and where we were trying to go, and it told us we were going the wrong way. And we were going the wrong way. We'd been going the wrong way for hours. Dutch looked up and his eyes were wet. And then right at the end, when Cole went down and we thought he was going to die, there was a light down the mountain, a red light just for a few seconds pointing exactly the way we needed to go. And then it was gone. And we went toward where it'd been, and we found the road and we found the trucks. He shook his head slowly. Somebody helped us. At the end, somebody put that light there. The same somebody that was hunting us all day just helped us, right at the end. And I can't make any of it make sense. Mercer wrote it all down, every impossible word of it, and knew as he wrote it that not one line of it would hold up anywhere. Footsteps with no feet, a voice that knew their names, a deer that wasn't there, a light that appeared and vanished. It was the testimony of 4 exhausted, hypothermic, terrified men, and any defense attorney in the country would take it apart in 10 minutes, and any judge would throw it out, and there was not one shred of physical evidence to support a word of it. No wounds, no weapons fired at them. Ballistics on the men's own rifles would show Only Cole's panicked shots into the timber, and the rounds Breck and Randy had wasted on empty air. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trace anywhere of anyone but themselves. 6:30 a.m. Mercer drove up the Carter Mountain. He went alone, and he went slowly up the washed-out logging road in the gray morning light, and the whole way up, he tried to decide what he was going to say and how he was going to say it. Because he knew, of course he knew, there was only one person on that mountain, only one person it could have been, and he'd known from the moment Marcus called him at 4:40 in the morning. The only question was what he could prove, and the answer he already suspected was nothing. He found Ava Carter splitting wood in front of her cabin, and the ordinariness of it stopped him cold. She looked exactly as she had in his office, calm, unhurried. She set down the axe when his truck pulled up, and she wiped her hands on her jeans, and she waited for him to come to her, and there was nothing in her face at all. No guilt, no fear, no triumph, nothing. "Sheriff," she said, "little early for a visit." "Miss Carter." He got out of the truck slowly. "I think you probably know why I'm here." "I don't actually, but I'd guess it has something to do with the trucks that were parked at the bottom of my road yesterday and the gunshots I heard up here on my land all afternoon." She said it evenly. "I filed a report about the trespassing weeks ago. You have it in your office. I documented everything like I told you I would. And yesterday, 5 men came up my road with rifles, and I heard shooting on my property most of the day. I stayed in my cabin. I've got the doors reinforced. I've got cameras. I wasn't going to go out and confront 5 armed men who'd already been warned." "Is that what happened? Did something happen to them?" And Mercer stood there in the cold morning and understood with a kind of grim admiration exactly how good she was, because every word of it was defensible. She'd filed the report. She'd documented the trespassing. 5 armed men had come onto her land after being warned in writing with the sheriff as witness. She'd stayed in her cabin, and could she prove that she could? Because of course she could. He'd find out later that her cabin cameras had a time-stamped feed showing the interior of her cabin, showing her moving around inside cooking, reading, going to bed footage that would place her at home all day and all night. He didn't know yet how she'd done it, whether it was old footage or a decoy or something cleverer than either, and he'd never be able to prove it was anything but exactly what it appeared to be. She had an alibi. She had documentation. She had every legal protection a landowner could have. And he was certain, done something to 4 men on that mountain that had broken one of them so badly he was sitting on his porch unable to speak. "4 men are hurt, Miss Carter," Mercer said carefully. "One of them's in the hospital, nearly died of exposure. The others they're not right. Something happened to them up here. On my land, where they were trespassing with firearms. They say somebody was up here with them, hunting them, playing tricks. Footsteps, voices, lights. They say a voice knew their names." Ava tilted her head slightly. "Sheriff, I live alone on 640 acres of mountain. I heard 5 men shooting guns on my property all day. And you're telling me those 5 men, those 5 armed men who came onto my land after I warned them, after I filed a report, after you personally went and told them to stop, those men got scared up here in the dark and hurt themselves, stumbling around, and now they're saying a ghost did it." She let that sit for a moment. "What is it you think I did exactly? What is it you think one woman did to 5 armed men that left not a mark on any of them that you could put in a report?" And there it was. She'd said it out loud, the thing he'd been circling, and the thing that made the whole case impossible. What could he put in a report? Footsteps with no feet, a voice that knew their names. He'd be laughed out of the county attorney's office. There was no crime here that he could name. There was no evidence here that he could hold. There was only a broken man on a porch and a hospital bed, and 4 impossible stories, and a calm woman splitting wood, and nothing that connected them that any court in the world would accept. "Can I see your cabin footage?" Mercer asked. "From yesterday?" "Of course," Ava said without hesitation, and that hesitation that wasn't told him everything and nothing. "Come inside, I'll pull it up. You can see I was home all day." 7:48 a.m. He watched the footage. It showed exactly what she'd said it would show. Ava Carter in her cabin all day and all night. Time-stamped. Continuous. Unbroken. She'd been home the entire time. And Mercer sat there watching it and knew with total certainty and zero proof that it was a lie, that somehow, some way, this woman had spent that entire day and night out on the mountain doing something to four men, while a camera dutifully recorded an empty performance of her innocence. And he could not for the life of him figure out how, and he understood that he never would. That was the moment Sheriff Daniel Mercer stopped being an investigator and started being a witness. Because there was nothing to investigate. There was only something to have seen and to carry and to never be able to prove. The case, such as it was, unraveled fast. Cole recovered physically over the following week, but he wouldn't talk about the mountain. And when pressed, he'd start shaking, and his mother finally told Mercer to leave her son alone. Dutch gave a statement and then recanted the strangest parts of it, not because they weren't true, but because he'd realized how they sounded, and a man protecting his own reputation is a poor witness. Randy wouldn't come out of his house, and Breck was the twist Mercer never saw coming, the thing that turned the whole story from a mystery into something closer to a tragedy. Because 3 weeks after that night, Breck Holloway walked into Mercer's office alone and sat down across the desk, the same desk where Ava had sat weeks before, and confessed. Not to a crime. There was no crime to confess to. Breck confessed to something else, something Mercer hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. "I need to tell you the truth," Breck said. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. He'd lost weight. His hands shook. About all of it. Not just the mountain. About the mountain and about what kind of man I've been. Because I've been thinking Danny. That's all I do now is think. I can't sleep, so I think. And I've had a lot of time to think about what happened up there and about why. Breck, let me finish, please. Breck took a breath. She didn't do anything to us. That woman. I know everybody thinks she did, and maybe she did. Maybe she was up there the whole time doing whatever she did. But here's the thing I figured out, Danny, lying awake every night for 3 weeks. She didn't put anything in my head that wasn't already there. He looked up. The fear, the thing that broke me. It wasn't hers, it was mine. I was afraid the whole time of one thing, one single thing. And it wasn't ghosts, and it wasn't the dark. I was afraid that I was going to get those men killed. My men. Because I wouldn't back down. Because I never back down. Because I've spent my whole life being the guy who never backs down, and I dragged 4 men up a mountain to prove it, and I almost got every one of them killed, and the whole time, the whole night, that's what was screaming in my head. Not her, me. My own self finally telling me the truth about who I am. Mercer sat very still. She didn't hunt us, Breck said quietly. She held up a mirror, somehow, and she made me look in it. And I didn't like what I saw. I have never in my life liked what I saw, and I spent 44 years making sure I never had to look. And she took that away from me. In one night, she made me look. His voice broke. And now I can't stop looking, Danny. That's the thing. That's the thing nobody understands. She didn't ruin me up on that mountain. She just made me see what I already was, and I can't unsee it. He put his head down on Mercer's desk and cried, and Mercer sat there and did not know what to do because there was no law for this, no report for this, no box on any form for a man destroyed by finally seeing himself clearly. And in that moment, Mercer understood the true shape of what Ava Carter had done, and it was so much larger and stranger and more terrible than anything he had imagined. She hadn't just scared them. She'd taken each man's own worst truth about himself and made it real, made it stand up and walk around in the dark, and then left him alone with it. Randy's cowardice, Cole's recklessness, Dutch's guilt, and Breck's whole life, his whole terrible refusal to ever back down, ever apologize, ever admit he might be wrong about anything. She hadn't fired a shot. She'd done something far more precise. She'd shown 4 men exactly who they were. 8:15. Later that week, Mercer drove back up the mountain one last time. Not to arrest her. He'd given up on that. He drove up because he needed to understand, needed to look her in the eye and know for himself whether she'd done what he thought she'd done. He found her on the porch this time, coffee in her hands, watching the sun come up over the ridge, and he sat down beside her without being asked, and for a while neither of them said anything. Breck Holloway came to see me, Mercer finally said. Confessed, not to a crime, to being who he is. Said you held up a mirror. Ava didn't answer. I'm not going to charge you, Mercer said. You know that. There's nothing to charge you with. No evidence, no crime, no way to prove a single thing happened up here that you didn't say happened. You're clean, completely clean. He turned and looked at her. But I'm going to ask you one time off the record, just between us, and then I'll never ask again. Did you do it? Were you up there? Did you do that to those men? Ava was quiet for a long moment. She watched the sun clear the ridge and spill gold light down across the mountain that was hers, finally completely hers. And then she said, without looking at him, in a voice as flat and level and deep as the pond he'd first seen in her eyes weeks ago in his office, I'll tell you what I did, Sheriff. I gave 5 men every chance in the world to leave me alone. I filed a report. I put up signs. I sent you to talk to them. I did everything right, everything, and they came anyway with guns laughing onto my land to prove a point. She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before, something old and tired and human. And whatever happened to them up on that mountain, whatever they saw, whatever they heard, whatever they were finally forced to look at, every bit of it was already inside them before they ever crossed my fence. I didn't put it there. I don't have that power. Nobody does. All I did, she paused, all anyone can ever do is take away the noise, the bluster, the 5 against 1. Take away all the things a man hides behind and leave him alone in the dark with himself. And if what's left is a good man, he walks out fine. And if what's left is Breck Holloway, she turned back to the sunrise, then he walks out the way Breck walked out. But I didn't make him that man, Sheriff. He made himself that man over 44 years. I just introduced them. Mercer looked at her for a long, long time. Then he stood and set his empty coffee cup on the porch rail and walked to his truck, and he never came back up that mountain again. And he never spoke of that conversation to another living soul. And he closed the case as accidental death by exposure and environmental factors, because that was in the end the literal truth, and because there was nothing else he could write, and because some part of him had come to believe that whatever justice was, it had already been done up on that mountain in the dark by a woman who never fired a shot. 9 o'clock. He drove down off the mountain into the valley, and behind him, Ava Carter sat on her porch in the morning light, opponing on her land in her silence with everything she had ever wanted. Finally completely hers, and the mountain kept her secret, the way it would keep it for years, the way it would keep it long after the men were gone, and the story had changed into something else entirely, something that would outlast every one of them. The men were alive, all 5. That was the thing that would never make it into any story people told later. Ava had killed no one. She'd broken them, marked them, sent them home, changed forever. But they were alive, everyone, and that had been her choice made in the freezing dark at the last moment when the mountain would gladly have finished them. She'd given every chance, right down to the last one, right down to a red flare in the dark that none of them would ever understand. And now she was alone, and it was quiet, and the mountain was hers. She'd gotten exactly what she came here for, every bit of it. She sat on her porch in the gold morning light, and she drank her coffee, and she watched the sun climb over the ridge, and she waited to feel like it had all been worth it. She was still waiting. She was still waiting when the first reporter called. It came about a month after Mercer closed the case. A young woman from the regional paper who'd caught wind of the story the way these things always get caught, a nurse at the hospital who'd talked to deputy, who'd said too much at the bar, a rumor passing from mouth to mouth until it reached someone whose job was to write things down. She called the county office first, and Mercer told her there was no story. Just some hunters who'd gotten lost and cold and scared. A common enough thing in the mountains in late fall. She didn't believe him. She could hear in his voice that he didn't believe himself. So she got Ava's number somehow, the way reporters do, and she called the cabin, and Ava answered on the second ring. Miss Carter, my name's Jenna Pohl. I'm with the Tribune. I'm doing a piece on what happened up on your property back in October. I was hoping you might be willing to talk to me. Nothing happened on my property in October, Ava said. 5 men went up there. 1 nearly died. They're saying, I know what they're saying. Ava's voice didn't change at all. 5 men trespassed on my land with firearms after being warned repeatedly in writing with the sheriff as a witness. They got lost and cold and hurt themselves. That's the whole story. There's no mystery in it. Men who go into mountains they don't respect sometimes don't come out the way they went in. That's not a story. That's just the mountain. They say someone was up there with them. There was no one up there but them. A pause. And me in my cabin with the doors locked, doing exactly what any woman living alone would do when 5 armed men show up on her land. The sheriff has my footage. He's seen it. Ask him. And that was all Jenna Pohl ever got, and the piece she eventually wrote was thin and hedged and full of the word allegedly, and it ran on page 6 and was forgotten in a week by everyone except the people in the valley who did not forget, who would never forget, because they didn't need a newspaper to tell them what they already felt in their bones every time they looked up at the Carter Mountain. But the phone call did something to Ava that the whole long night on the mountain hadn't quite done. It made her afraid, not of being caught. She'd known from the start she wouldn't be caught. She was afraid of being known, because being known was the one thing she'd come to this mountain to escape, the one thing she'd bought 640 acres of stubborn wilderness specifically to avoid. She'd wanted to be no one, a quiet woman living alone. And now, because 5 men couldn't leave her be, she was becoming something else in the mind of the whole county, becoming a story, becoming a name spoken in a certain lowered voice, and the irony of it was so bitter she could taste it. She'd defended her invisibility so completely that she'd made herself the most visible person in the valley. She sat with that for a long time in the days after the reporter's call. She thought about leaving. She actually thought about it, selling the land, moving on, finding somewhere even more remote, starting over as no one again. She'd done it before. She knew how. Disappearing was the one skill she had that these mountains couldn't take from her. But then she thought about what leaving would mean, and she understood that it would mean Breck Holloway had won after all. Not the way he'd wanted to win, but won all the same, ripping her off her own land, out of her own peace, exactly the way he'd set out to do the day he heard a woman had bought his mountain and laughed into his beer. If she left, everything she'd done that long night would come to nothing. The men would have taken her peace, after all, just slowly, just at a distance, just through the long reach of a story she couldn't control. So she stayed. She decided to stay, and she decided something else too, something harder, that she would let the story grow, that she would not fight it, that she would let the valley believe whatever it needed to believe, because a story, she realized, was the one weapon she had left, the one thing that would keep the next Breck Holloway and the one after that from ever setting foot on her land again. She had spent one night breaking 5 men. But a story, if she let it grow, would do the work of that night forever without her ever having to lift a finger again. The legend was the fence. The legend was the thing that would finally truly make the boundary hold. And so Ava Carter did the one thing that was hardest of all for a woman who'd spent her whole life staying invisible. She let herself be seen just a little, just enough. She started coming to town on different days at different hours, so the pattern the locals had built their comfort on dissolved into unpredictability. She let them wonder. When Earl Dawson, the old Vietnam veteran, tipped his hat to her at the diner one morning with a look of grave respect, she nodded back and let him think whatever he was thinking and did not correct the awe in his eyes. When children dared each other to ride their bikes up to the bottom of her road and turned back at the first of her signs, she let the fear do its work. She fed the legend the way a person feeds a fire, carefully, deliberately, never too much at once, and it grew and it spread, and it became over that winter. The truest kind of protection there is the kind that lives in other people's minds and does its work while you sleep. Breck Holloway did not recover. That was the part of it Ava carried hardest in the quiet months that followed, on the nights when the wind came down off the ridge, and she lay awake with the old faces and now a new one among them. He didn't die. She'd made sure of that up on the mountain with the flare in the dark. But the man who came down off her mountain that night was not the man who'd gone up, and he never became that man again. And in a way that Ava understood better than anyone, that was its own kind of dying. She heard about it in pieces, the way you hear about anything in a small county. Breck had stopped drinking. Breck had stopped hunting, had sold his rifles, all of them, given them away. Couldn't stand to have them in the house. Breck spent his days doing small, quiet work around his property and his evenings sitting on his porch looking at the mountains, and he'd become, people said, gentle, which was a word no one had ever used about Breck Holloway in his life. Gentle and quiet and haunted and kind, in a careful, broken way, like a man walking on a leg that had been shattered and set wrong and would never be quite right again. Marcus told her about it eventually. Marcus, of all people, the one who'd left, one who'd earned the valley, the one she'd let go. He came up her road one afternoon in the spring on foot, slowly, with his hands visible the whole way, stopping at the first sign, and calling out that he meant no harm, that he just wanted to talk. And Ava, watching him from the porch, had made a decision she surprised herself with. She'd come down and met him at the fence. "I know it was you," Marcus said. He didn't say it like an accusation. He said it quietly, almost gently. "Up on the mountain, I don't know how, and I'm never going to tell anybody, and there's nothing to tell anyway, because I got no proof of nothing. But I felt you up there all day. I was the only one who felt you, and I tried to tell them, and they wouldn't listen." He looked at her steadily. "I just wanted to come up here and tell you two things, and then I'll go and I won't ever bother you again. First thing is thank you for letting me leave. I don't know why you did, but I know you could have done to me whatever you did to them, and you didn't, and I've thought about that every single day since." Ava said nothing. She watched him waiting. "Second thing," Marcus took a breath. "Breck's different now. You probably heard, and I know he had it coming. I know what kind of man he was. I was there, I saw it all my life. But I've been going out to see him. Somebody's got to. And the man out there on that porch, he ain't the man who went up that mountain. He's better. He's a better man than I ever thought he could be. Broke him to make him, but he's better." Marcus's voice caught. "I don't know if that matters to you. I don't know if you meant to do that or if it just happened. But I thought you should know that whatever you did up there, it didn't just break him. Somewhere in the breaking, it made something too. And I don't think a lot of people can say they've ever done that to anybody. Broke a bad man into a good one." He stepped back from the fence. "That's all. That's all I came to say." And he turned and walked back down her road, and Ava stood at the fence for a long time after he'd gone, and she thought about what he'd said, and she found that it did not comfort her the way he'd meant it to. Because Marcus was wrong about one thing. She hadn't made Breck into a good man. She didn't have that power, and she'd told Mercer as much, and she'd meant it. All she'd done was strip Breck down to whatever was underneath the noise, and it had turned out that underneath the noise, there was a frightened man who'd spent his whole life running from himself, and when the running finally stopped, he'd had to sit down in the wreckage and start over. But the starting over that was Breck's. She hadn't given him that. She'd only taken away his ability to keep hiding. What he'd built in the ruins was his own, and she couldn't take credit for it any more than she could take blame. And the not knowing which it was credit or blame was exactly the weight she'd carried down off every mountain she'd ever been on. That was the thing none of them understood, not Marcus, not Mercer, not the whole Whispering Valley. They thought she'd won. They thought she'd stood on that mountain like an avenging spirit and dealt out justice and come away clean and victorious, the quiet woman who couldn't be crossed. And in the story that spread through the valley that winter and grew into legend, that was exactly who she was. A boundary that couldn't be crossed. A force of nature in the shape of a woman. Someone who'd faced down 5 men and won without firing a shot. But Ava knew the truth, and the truth was quieter and sadder than the legend, the way the truth almost always is. The truth was that she hadn't wanted any of it. She'd wanted peace. She'd wanted silence and discipline in the passage of undisturbed days. She'd wanted to bury the person she used to be so deep that even she couldn't find her anymore. And instead, 5 arrogant men had reached down into that grave and pulled the old Ava back out and made her use the old tools and reminded her that the person she'd been trying to bury wasn't buried at all, was just sleeping, was just waiting under the surface for the moment she'd be needed again. She'd proven that long night on the mountain that she could still do it, that everything the country had trained into her was still there, still sharp, still hers. And that proof was not a comfort, it was the opposite of a comfort. It was the thing she'd come to this mountain to never have to know about herself again. She'd won the mountain. She'd lost the thing she'd come to the mountain for. 9:40 on a spring morning, months after the longest night of her life, Ava Carter sat on her porch and watched the sun climb over the ridge, and she finally understood what she'd been waiting to feel and why it hadn't come. There was no victory in it. There was never going to be any victory in it. There was only the quiet and the mountain and the long wait of knowing exactly what she was capable of, which she'd carried up here, hoping to set down, and which she now understood she would carry to the end of her life up any mountain, into any silence, no matter how remote. There was no land far enough. There was no fence high enough. The thing she'd been running from had been inside the truck with her the whole way up, patient in the passenger seat, waiting. She'd made herself a legend, and a legend she was learning is just a story other people tell about a person who has to go on being that person after the story ends. The valley would tell their version for years, the woman who couldn't be crossed the mountain that never gave the hunters back the same. And Ava would live inside that story like a woman living inside a house built around her while she slept. Its walls made of other people's fear and awe, protecting her and imprisoning her in exactly the same motion. Poaching in the region dropped to nothing that year. That much of the legend was true. No hunter came within a mile of her fence. The deer came back and the elk, and one morning she watched a black bear amble across her meadow without a care, the first she'd seen since she'd bought the place. And something in her chest loosened for just a moment at the sight of it. The mountain was healing. The wildlife was returning. The forest was becoming what it should have been all along. A place left alone, a place at peace. She'd done that. Whatever else she'd done that. Maybe she thought watching the bear disappear into the timber, maybe that would have to be enough. Maybe the peace of the mountain would have to stand in for the peace she hadn't found in herself. Maybe you didn't always get to be at peace. Maybe sometimes the most you could do was build a place where peace could exist and guard it, and let the guarding be the thing that gave your life its shape, even if the guarding cost you the very peace you were protecting. Maybe that was the deal. Maybe that had always been the deal for people like her, the ones who'd learned the terrible arts, who could never quite unlearn them, who ended up standing at the edges of other people's peace as the price of it, keepers of a quiet they could protect but never fully enter. She stood up from this porch. She picked up her axe. She had wood to split and a fence to check and a perimeter to walk and the day's discipline waiting for her the way it waited every day, the structure she'd built her life around, the thing that kept the old faces at bay. She looked up at the mountain one more time, her mountain, hers completely won and held and kept, and she felt the thing she'd been waiting all these months to feel finally arrive. And it was not victory and it was not peace. It was acceptance. The quiet level, bone-deep acceptance of a woman who has finally stopped waiting to become someone other than who she is. Ava Carter shouldered her axe and turned and walked out to begin the day's work alone on her land. In her silence, a boundary that could not be crossed, standing guard over a peace she had made for everything on that mountain except herself. And the mountain kept her secret, and the valley told its story, and the years began one quiet, disciplined day at a time to close over the whole thing like still water closing over a stone. The still water did not stay still for long, because stories, once they start to grow, have a way of drawing new people toward them. In the following autumn, almost exactly a year after the longest night of Ava Carter's life, a new man came to the valley who had heard the legend and decided it was a challenge. His name was Cutter Vane, and he was everything Breck Holloway had been before the mountain remade him. Only worse, because where Breck had been a local man with local pride, Cutter Vane was an outsider who'd built his whole reputation on doing the things other men were too afraid to do. He ran a guided hunting operation 2 counties over the illegal kind, the kind that promised wealthy clients a trophy, no matter the season, no matter the land, no matter the law. He'd been run off 3 different properties in 2 states. He had a following of men who paid good money to feel dangerous, and he had an ego that could not tolerate the existence of a place other hunters were afraid to go. When Cutter Vane heard about the Carter Mountain, heard it in a bar, the same way Breck had heard about Ava a year before, the story passing from mouth to mouth, until it reached the one man in the world most likely to take it as an insult. He laughed and he set down his drink, and he said the words that Ava, a year earlier, had heard a different man say in a different bar about her. "A woman," Cutter said. "Some soldier woman scared off 5 local boys with campfire tricks, and now the whole county's too chicken to hunt a mountain full of trophy elk. That's the funniest thing I ever heard." He grinned around at his men. "Boys, I think we found our next hunt, and I think when we're done, this valley's gonna have a new story to tell about what happens to a woman who thinks she can spook Cutter Vane." 10 o'clock on a gray October morning one year, in change from the night that made her a legend, Ava Carter stood at her fence line and read the fresh boot prints in the mud, and knew the way she'd known once before that it was starting again. She'd found the signs of scouting for a week, different from Breck's crew, more careful, more professional. Whoever this was, they knew what they were doing. They'd found her cameras and avoided them mostly. They'd studied her fence. They'd moved at night. This was not 5 arrogant locals blundering onto her land to make a point. This was a hunter, a real one, someone who'd come specifically because of the legend, someone who understood there was a person behind the ghost and had come to prove that the person could be beaten. And Ava, standing at her fence in the cold, felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt tired. She'd done this once. She'd paid the price of it, the sleepless nights, the old faces, the weight of knowing what she was still capable of. She'd told herself the legend would be enough, that the story would guard the mountain, so she'd never have to become that person again. And here was the proof that the legend wasn't enough, that a legend is just a challenge to a certain kind of man. That the very story she'd built to protect her peace had reached out across 2 counties and drawn exactly the kind of predator most likely to test it. She'd made herself famous as the woman who couldn't be crossed, and fame like that doesn't keep the wolves away. It calls them. She could do it again. She knew she could. She had the mountain, she had the training. She had every advantage she'd had a year ago. She could take Cutter Vane and his men apart the same way she'd taken Breck's crew apart, could break them in the dark and send them running, and add another chapter to the legend that would keep the next challenger away for another year, until the next Cutter Vane heard the bigger story and came to test the bigger boundary, and on forever. A war with no end, each victory buying only the certainty of the next battle. That was the twist she had not seen a year ago. The thing she understood now, standing at her fence in the cold, that a legend built on fear is not a wall. It's a magnet. And she had spent a year making herself the most powerful magnet in the region for exactly the men she least wanted to meet. So Ava did something that night that the woman of a year ago could never have done. She drove down off her mountain into the valley in the dark, and she went to see Breck Holloway. She'd never spoken to him. In a year of living 12 miles apart, of him being the central figure in the story that had remade both their lives, she had never once laid eyes on the man up close, never heard his voice except carrying up a draw or coming out of a hidden speaker in her own recording. She knew him only as the enemy she'd broken. And now she drove to his house in the dark and parked in his yard and sat in her truck for a long moment before she made herself get out, because she did not know what she was doing. Only that the old way had failed and she needed something she didn't have, and Breck Holloway, of all the people in the world, was the only one who might understand. He was on his porch the way people said he always was, now sitting in the dark looking at the mountains. He watched her truck pull in and he watched her get out, and he did not move. And when she came to the bottom of his steps and stopped, the two of them looked at each other for the first time in the light of his porch bulb, the man she'd broken and the woman who'd broken him, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "I know who you are," Breck said finally, quietly, without heat. "I've known for a year. I felt you up there at the end, the light in the dark. That was you. You could have let us die and you didn't." He studied her face. "I always wondered if you'd come. I thought about it a lot, what I'd say. And now you're here and I got nothing." He almost smiled. "Ain't that something?" "There's a man coming," Ava said. She hadn't planned to say it so plainly, but standing there, she found she had no patience left for anything but the truth. "Cutter Vane, he heard the story. He's coming to prove he can beat me. He's got men. He's got skill. He's not like—" She stopped. "He's not like you were. He's worse. And he's coming because of the story, because of what I made myself into after that night. I built the legend to keep men away, and instead it brought the worst one right to my door." Breck nodded slowly, like this was something he'd been expecting. "And you came to me," he said. "Why, And Ava said the thing she'd driven 12 miles in the dark to say, the thing she hadn't fully understood until it was out of her mouth. "Because I don't want to do it again," she said, and her voice cracked on it, the first crack Breck had ever heard in that flat, level voice. The first crack maybe anyone had heard in years. "I can do it. I can take him apart the way I took you apart. But every time I do it, the story gets bigger and the next man gets worse, and I spend the rest of my life on that mountain fighting a war that never ends, becoming more and more the thing I came up here to stop being. I broke you to protect my peace, and I've had a year to learn that you can't protect peace by breaking people. All you do is make more people who need breaking." She looked up at him. "You're the only one who knows what happened up there, the only one who understands what it does, to them and to me. So I came to ask you, because I've got no one else in the world to ask, how do I stop? How do I end this without becoming exactly what Cutter Vane thinks I already am?" 11 o'clock at night on Breck Holloway's porch, and the man who a year ago had been the loudest, cruelest, most arrogant man in the county looked at the woman who'd destroyed him and then rebuilt something better in the wreckage. And he gave her the answer that only he of all people could have given. You don't fight him, Breck said. That's the first thing. You already know that or you wouldn't be here. Fighting him is how he wins because fighting him is what keeps the story going. He leaned forward. You want to end the story? You got to change what the story's about. Right now, the story's about a woman who breaks men. Scary woman on the mountain, don't cross her, she'll destroy you. And that story, that's catnip for a man like this Vane. Because a man like that lives to break the unbreakable thing. He paused. But there's another story you could tell, and it's a truer one. And it's a lot harder because it means letting people see the part of you that you've spent your whole life hiding. What story? The true one, Breck said. The one where the woman on the mountain didn't break 5 men out of cruelty, where she gave them every chance in the world first, where she went to the sheriff, put up the signs, warned them and warned them and warned them, and they came anyway. And where this is the part that changes everything, where at the end, when the mountain was going to kill them, she saved their lives. All 5 of them. She put a light in the dark and she led them home. And not one of them died when she could have let every one of us freeze and no one would ever have known. Breck's voice had gone rough. That's the true story. And you know what that story says? It don't say, don't cross her or she'll destroy you. It says she'll give you every chance to do right. And if you don't, she'll show you exactly who you are. And then she'll save your life anyway. That ain't a story that makes a man like Cutter Vane want to fight you. That's a story that makes him look small for even trying. You can't beat a woman who saves the men who came to hurt her. There's no trophy in it. There's no proving anything against mercy. Mercy's the one thing his whole ego's got no answer for. Ava stared at him. You want to end it? Breck said. You stop being the ghost that hunts men. You start being the thing you actually were up there at the very end when it counted. You be the one who saves them, and you let that be the story. And I'll tell it. God knows I'll tell it. I'm the proof of it. I'm the man you saved. I'll stand in the middle of town and tell anybody who'll listen exactly what you did and exactly what it made me. And a story like that coming from a man like me, about a woman like you, he shook his head. Cutter Vane won't know what to do with it. You'll have taken his war away from him before he ever fires a shot. And that was the twist that turned everything, the deepest twist of the whole long story that the man Ava had broken, held in the wreckage of who he'd been, the one key she needed to finally set herself free. Not more fear, not another night on the mountain. The truth, the mercy she'd shown in the dark dragged out into the daylight and told as loudly as the terror had been whispered, until the legend of the woman who broke men became the legend of the woman who saved them. And a legend like that has no challenge in it for anyone because you cannot defeat someone by being spared. Cutter Vane came for the mountain 11 days later, and the mountain did not have to do a single thing to him. Because in those 11 days, the story changed. Breck Holloway did exactly what he'd promised. He went into town, into the diner where Earl Dawson drank his decaf, into the bar where he'd once laughed about the soldier girl, into every place in the valley where men gathered and talked, and he told the true story. He told it plain and he told it against himself, the way only a genuinely changed man can, holding nothing back about who he'd been or what he'd deserved. He told them about the warnings they'd ignored and the signs they'd torn down, and the sheriff they'd sent away laughing. He told them about the dark and the fear and the moment Cole went down and should have died. And then he told them about the light, the red flare in the black, appearing for exactly 5 seconds, pointing exactly the right way, put there by the very woman they'd come to threaten, the woman who could have watched them all freeze and instead reached down and carried them home. She saved my life, Breck told them. After I spat on her fence and called her names and dragged 4 men up there to prove I could. She had every reason in the world to let me die, and she saved me instead. And then she let me become a better man than I ever was and never asked for one word of credit for it. His voice would break, telling it every time. So I don't want to hear anybody in this valley talk about that woman with fear. You want to talk about her. You talk about her with respect, because she's the most decent person on that whole mountain, and I'm the proof, and I'll fight any man who says different. And the story spread, the true one, and it was a better story than the legend had ever been, because it was real, and because everyone could feel it was real, and because it came from the last man on earth who'd have any reason to praise Ava Carter. Earl Dawson, the old soldier who'd read her true from the first day in the parking lot, heard it and nodded like a man who'd known all along. And when Cutter Vane's truck rolled into the valley 11 days later, loaded with his paying clients and his illegal gear and his enormous ego, he found a valley that did not look at him the way he'd expected. He'd expected fear. He'd expected people who'd whisper about the dangerous woman on the mountain and secretly cheer him for going where they were too afraid to go. Instead, he found a valley that looked at him with something worse than fear: contempt. Because the story had changed, and in the new story, Cutter Vane wasn't a bold hunter testing an unbeatable foe. He was a bully driving 2 counties to threaten a woman who'd once saved the lives of the men who came to hurt her. There was no glory in that. There was no trophy in that. There was only a small, ugly man doing a small, ugly thing, and everyone in the valley could see it, and they let him see that they could see it. He went up the mountain anyway. Of course he did. Men like Cutter Vane can't stop once they've started, can't stand to back down, can't tolerate looking small. The same disease Breck had carried, the same one the mountain had cured him of. Cutter drove up the washed-out road with his clients, and he crossed Ava's fence, and he waited for the ghost to come. The ghost did not come. Because Ava had made her choice, the hardest choice of her life, harder than any night on any mountain. She did nothing. She stayed in her cabin. She did not rig a single wire or move a single stone or whisper a single name in the dark. She let Cutter Vane and his men hunt her mountain in broad daylight, and she did not touch them because she understood at last that touching them was the trap that every ghost she conjured fed the legend that drew them, and that the only way to end the war was to refuse to fight it. And a strange thing happened. Cutter Vane, waiting all day for a fear that never arrived, hunting a mountain that stayed utterly ordinary, found that his own reputation began to curdle in his mouth. He'd come to conquer a monster. There was no monster. There was just a mountain and a quiet woman who wouldn't come out, and a valley below that was laughing at him. Not afraid laughing, and the more nothing happened, the more foolish he looked, and the more foolish he looked, the more his clients began to grumble about the money they'd paid to hunt a ghost that didn't exist. By nightfall, Cutter Vane had bagged nothing proven, nothing conquered, nothing. He came down off the mountain, not broken like Breck had been, but something almost worse for a man like him, diminished, made small, made ordinary. He'd driven 2 counties to defeat a legend and found only a locked cabin and a woman who wouldn't dignify him with a fight. And there is no defeat more total for a man whose whole self is built on being dangerous than to discover that the thing he came to conquer simply doesn't consider him worth the effort. He never came back, and no one else came after him. Because the story that spread now was not the story of the ghost who hunted men, but the story of the woman so untouchable she didn't even have to try, who'd let Cutter Vane hunt her whole mountain and come away with nothing, who'd beaten him by refusing to acknowledge he existed. And that story, the story of mercy and dismissal combined, was a fence no hunter would ever climb because there was nothing on the other side of it to win. Ava Carter had finally built the boundary that would hold, not out of fear, out of the truth. The years went by. Poaching in the region did not just drop, it ended. The mountain healed completely and became known over time not as a place of fear, but as a place of peace, a sanctuary. People started calling it the Great Untouched Sanctuary at the head of the valley, where the wildlife came back thick as it had been a century before. Ava led a wildlife biologist onto her land, eventually the first person she'd invited up in years, and then a few more, and the mountain became, in a quiet, unofficial way, a kind of preserve protected by a woman who guarded it the way she'd once guarded everything, with total discipline and total commitment, but no longer with fear. Oh. Breck Holloway and Ava Carter became, in the strange way that only the deepest wounds can bind 2 people. Something almost like friends, not close. They never spoke of that night directly, not once in all the years. But he'd come up her road sometimes in the daylight with his hands visible, and she'd meet him at the fence, and they'd stand and talk about small things, the weather and the elk and the way the aspens turned. 2 people who'd seen each other more nakedly than most people ever see anyone, held together by a single terrible night that had destroyed one of them and freed the other, and in the end, remade them both. And the old faces that had followed Ava up the mountain, the ones from before, from the other side of the world, the ones she'd come here to escape, they did not leave her. She'd stopped expecting them to. But somewhere in those years, in the healing of the mountain and the slow, strange grace of her friendship with the man she'd broken, they grew quieter. Not gone, never gone, but quieter the way the mountain grew quiet in the deep of winter, a silence that was not emptiness, but peace. She'd come to the mountain to disappear, and she'd become a legend instead. And then she'd done the hardest thing of all. She'd let the legend become the truth, and the truth had finally set her free in a way that no amount of hiding ever could have. She had learned at enormous cost over many hard years the one lesson that all her training had never taught her, that you cannot protect peace by making people afraid that fear only breeds more of the thing it's meant to stop. And that the only boundary strong enough to truly hold is the one built not on what you're willing to do to people, but on what you're willing to do for them. Ava Carter grew old on her mountain. She died there many years later. An old woman in her own cabin, in her own silence on her own land, and she died at peace, which was the one thing she'd wanted from the very beginning and the last thing she'd expected ever to have. The valley mourned her. Breck Holloway, older than her by a few years and outliving her by only a few months, wept at the news like a man who'd lost the person who'd given him his life, which in every way that mattered she was. And the story they told about her in the valley for generations after she was gone was not the story of the ghost who hunted 5 men through the dark. That story faded the way fear always fades into legend, and then into rumor, and then into nothing. The story that lasted was the true one. The story of the woman who gave every chance, who warned and warned and warned, and who, when the men who ignored her were finally dying in the dark, put a light in the blackness and led every one of them home, and then let the man she'd broken become the best man he'd ever be, and asked for nothing and guarded her mountain not with terror, but with mercy, until the whole valley came to understand that the strongest boundary in the world is not the one that destroys you for crossing it. It's the one that shows you exactly who you are and saves you anyway. That was Ava Carter. That was the truth of her, the truth that outlasted every legend and every year and every one of the men who had ever tried to cross her fence. She never fired a shot, and she changed an entire mountain, an entire valley, and every single life that ever crossed her path, not because she could not be crossed, but because, in the end, she chose mercy over vengeance, truth over fear, and peace over war. That is the whole story, and it is true, and it is finished.